An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 1. The Kerguelen Islands. No doubt the following narrative will be received with entire incredulity, but I think it well that the public should be put in possession of the facts narrated in An Antarctic Mystery. The public is free to believe them or not, as its good pleasure. No more appropriate scene for the wonderful and terrible adventures which I am about to relate could be imagined than the Desolation Islands, so called in 1779 by Captain Cook. I lived there for several weeks, and I can affirm, on the evidence of my own eyes and my own experience, that the famous explorer and navigator was happily inspired when he gave the islands that significant name. Geographical nomenclature, however, insists on the name of Kerguelen, which is generally adopted for the group which lies in 49° 45' south latitude and 69° 6' east longitude. This is just because in 1772 Baron Kerguelen, a Frenchman, was the first to discover those islands in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. Indeed, the commander of the squadron on that voyage believed he had found a new continent on the limit of the Antarctic seas, but in the course of a second expedition he recognized his error. There was only an archipelago. I may be believed when I assert that Desolation Islands is the only suitable name for this group of 300 isles or islets in the midst of the vast expanse of ocean, which is constantly disturbed by austral storms. Nevertheless, the group is inhabited, and the number of Europeans and Americans who formed the nucleus of the Kerguelen population at the date of the 2nd of August, 1839, had been augmented for 2 months past by a unit in my person. Just then I was waiting for an opportunity of leaving the place, having completed the geological and mineralogical studies which had brought me to the group in general and to Christmas Harbour in particular. Christmas Harbour belongs to the most important islet of the archipelago, one that is about half as large as Corsica. It is safe and easy and free of access. Your ship may ride securely at single anchor in its waters, while the bay remains free from ice. The Kerguelens possess hundreds of other fjords. Their coasts are notched and ragged, especially in the parts between the north and the southeast, where the little islets abound. The soil, of volcanic origin, is composed of quartz, mixed with a bluish stone. In summer it is covered with green mosses, grey lichens, various hardy plants, especially wild saxifrage. Only one edible plant grows there, a kind of cabbage, not found anywhere else, and very bitter of flavour. Great flocks of royal and other penguins people these islets, finding good lodging on their rocky and mossy surface. These stupid birds, in their yellow and white feathers, with their heads thrown back, and their wings like the sleeves of a monastic habit, look at a distance like monks in single file, walking in procession along the beach. The islands afford refuge to numbers of sea calves, seals, and sea elephants. The taking of those amphibious animals either on land or from the sea is profitable, and may lead to a trade which will bring a large number of vessels into these waters. On the day already mentioned, I was accosted while strolling on the port by mine host of mine inn. "Unless I am much mistaken, time is beginning to seem very long to you, Mr. Joerling." The speaker was a tall American, who kept the only inn on the port. "If you will not be offended, Mr. Atkins, I will acknowledge that I do find it long." "Of course I won't be offended. Am I not well used to answers of that kind, as the rocks of the Cape to the rollers?" "And you resist them equally well." Of course, from the day of your arrival at Christmas Harbour, when you came to the Green Cormorant, I said to myself that in a fortnight, if not in a week, you would have enough of it, and would be sorry you had landed in the Kerguelens. No, indeed, Mr. Atkins, I never regret anything I have done. That's a good habit, sir. Besides, I have gained knowledge by observing curious things here. I have crossed the rolling plains, covered with hardy stringy mosses, and I shall take away curious mineralogical and geological specimens with me. I have gone sealing, and taken sea calves with your people. I have visited the rookeries where the penguins and the albatross live together in good fellowship, and that was well worth my while. You have given me now and again a dish of petrel, seasoned by your own hand, and very acceptable when one has a fine healthy appetite. I have found a friendly welcome at the Green Cormorant, and I am very much obliged to you. But if I am right in my reckoning, it is 2 months since the Chilean two-master pinnace set me down at Christmas Harbour in mid-winter. And you want to get back to your own country, which is mine, Mr. Jeorling, to return to Connecticut, to Providence, our capital. Doubtless, Mr. Atkins, for I have been a globe-trotter for close upon 3 years. One must come to a stop and take root at some time. Yes, and when one has taken root, one puts out branches. Just so, Mr. Atkins. However, I have no relations living. It is likely that I shall be the last of my line. I am not likely to take a fancy for marrying at 40. Well, well, that is a matter of taste. 15 years ago I settled down comfortably at Christmas Harbour with my Betsy. She has presented me with 10 children, who in their turn will present me with grandchildren. Will you not return to the old country? What should I do there, Mr. Jeorling, and what could I ever have done there? There was nothing before me but poverty. Here, on the contrary, in these islands of desolation, where I have no reason to feel desolate, ease and competence have come to me and mine. No doubt, and I congratulate you, Mr. Atkins, for you are a happy man. Nevertheless, it is not impossible that the fancy may take you some day. Mr. Atkins answered by a vigorous and convincing shake of the head. It was very pleasant to hear this worthy American talk. He was completely acclimatized on his archipelago and to the conditions of life there. He lived with his family as the penguins lived in their rookeries. His wife was a valiant woman of the scriptural type. His sons were strong, hardy fellows, who did not know what sickness meant. His business was prosperous. The Green Cormorant had the custom of all the ships, whalers and others, that put in at Kerguelen. Atkins supplied them with everything they required, and no second inn existed at Christmas Harbour. His sons were carpenters, sailmakers, and fishers, and they hunted the amphibians in all the creeks during the hot season. In short, this was a family of honest folk, who fulfilled their destiny without much difficulty. "Once more, Mr. Atkins, let me assure you," I resumed, "I am delighted to have come to Kerguelen. I shall always remember the islands kindly. Nevertheless, I should not be sorry to find myself at sea again." "Come, Mr. Jeorling, you must have a little patience," said the philosopher. "You must not forget that the fine days will soon be here, in 5 or 6 weeks." "Yes, and in the meantime the hills and the plains, the rocks and the shores will be covered thick with snow, and the sun will not have strength to dispel the mists on the horizon." "Now, there you are again, Mr. Jeorling. Why, the wild grass is already peeping through the white sheet. Just look." "Yes, with a magnifying glass. Between ourselves, Atkins, could you venture to pretend that your bays are not still ice-locked in this month of August, which is the February of our northern hemisphere?" "I acknowledge that, Mr. Jeorling, but again I say have patience. The winter has been mild this year. The ships will soon show up, in the east or in the west, for the fishing season is near. May Heaven hear you, Atkins, and guide the Halbrane safely into port." "Captain Len Guy? Ah, he's a good sailor, although he's English. They are good people everywhere, and he takes his supplies at the Green Cormorant." "You think the Halbrane—" "You'll be signalled before a week, Mr. Jeorling, or if not, it will be because there is no longer a Captain Len Guy. And if there is no longer a Captain Len Guy, it is because the Halbrane has sunk in full sail between the Kerguelens and the Cape of Good Hope." Thereupon Mr. Atkins walked away, with a scornful gesture, indicating that such an eventuality was out of all probability. My intention was to take my passage on board the Halbrane so soon as she could come to her moorings in Christmas Harbour. After the rest of 6 or 7 days she would set sail again for Tristan d'Acunha, where she was to discharge her cargo of tin and copper. I meant to stay in the island for a few weeks of the fine season, and from thence set out for Connecticut. Nevertheless, I did not fail to take into due account the share that belongs to chance in human affairs, for it is wise, as Edgar Poe has said, always to reckon with the unforeseen, the unexpected, the inconceivable, which have a very large share in those affairs, and chance ought always to be a matter of strict calculation. Each day I walked about the port and its neighbourhood. The sun was growing strong. The rocks were emerging by degrees from their winter clothing of snow. Moss of a wine-like colour was springing up on the basalt cliffs. Strips of seaweed 50 yards long were floating on the sea, and on the plain lilas, which is of Andean origin, was pushing its little points, and the only leguminous plant of the region, that gigantic cabbage already mentioned, valuable for its antiscorbutic properties, was making its appearance. I had not come across a single land mammal. Sea mammals swarm in these waters, not even of the batrachian or reptilian kinds. A few insects only, butterflies or others, and even these did not fly, for before they could use their wings, the atmospheric currents carried the tiny bodies away to the surface of the rolling waves. "And the Halbrane?" I used to say to Atkins each morning. "The Halbrane, Mr. Jeorling," he would reply with complacent assurance, "will surely come into port to day, or if not to day, to morrow." In my rambles on the shore I frequently routed a crowd of amphibians, sending them plunging into the newly An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 2. The Schooner Halbrane. The Halbrane was a schooner of 300 tons, and a fast sailer. On board there was a captain, a mate or lieutenant, a boatswain, a cook, and 8 sailors, in all 12 men, a sufficient number to work the ship. Solidly built, copper bottomed, very manageable, well suited for navigation between the 40th and 60th parallel of south latitude, the Halbrane was a credit to the shipyards of Birkenhead. All this I learned from Atkins, who adorned his narrative with praise and admiration of its theme. Captain Len Guy, of Liverpool, was 3/5 owner of the vessel, which he had commanded for nearly 6 years. He traded in the southern seas of Africa and America, going from one group of islands to another, and from continent to continent. His ship's company was but a dozen men, it is true, but she was used for the purposes of trade only. He would have required a more numerous crew and all the implements for taking seals or other amphibia. The Halbrane was not defenceless, however; on the contrary, she was heavily armed, and this was well, for those southern seas were not too safe. They were frequented at that period by pirates, and on approaching the isles, the Halbrane was put into a condition to resist attack. Besides, the men always slept with one eye open. One morning, it was the 27th of August, I was roused out of my bed by the rough voice of the innkeeper and the tremendous thumps he gave my door. "Mr. Jeorling, are you awake?" "Of course I am, Atkins. How should I be otherwise, with all that noise going on? What's up?" "A ship 6 miles in the offing, to the northeast, steering for Christmas." "Will it be the Halbrane?" "We shall know that in a short time, Mr. Jeorling. At any rate, it is the first boat of the year, and we must give it a welcome." I dressed hurriedly and joined Atkins on the quay, where I found him in the midst of a group engaged in eager discussion. Atkins was indisputably the most considerable and considered man in the archipelago. Consequently, he secured the best listeners. The matter in dispute was whether the schooner in sight was or was not the Halbrane. The majority maintained that she was not, but Atkins was positive she was, although on this occasion he had only 2 backers. The dispute was carried on with warmth, the host of the Green Cormorant defending his view, and the dissentants maintaining that the fast approaching schooner was either English or American, until she was near enough to hoist her flag, and the Union Jack went fluttering up into the sky. Shortly after, the Halbrane lay at anchor in the middle of Christmas Harbour. The captain of the Halbrane, who received the demonstrative greeting of Atkins very coolly, it seemed to me, was about 45, red-faced, and solidly built, like his schooner. His head was large, his hair was already turning grey, his black eyes shone like coals of fire under his thick eyebrows, and his strong white teeth were set like rocks in his powerful jaws. His chin was lengthened by a coarse red beard, and his arms and legs were strong and firm. Such was Captain Len Guy, and he impressed me with the notion that he was rather impassive than hard, a shut-up sort of person, whose secrets it would not be easy to get at. I was told the very same day that my impression was correct, by a person who was better informed than Atkins, although the latter pretended to great intimacy with the captain. The truth was that nobody had penetrated that reserved nature. I may as well say at once that the person to whom I have alluded was the boatswain of the Halbrane, a man named Hurliguerly, who came from the Isle of Wight. This person was about 44, short, stout, strong, and bow-legged. His arms stuck out from his body, his head was set like a ball on a bull neck, his chest was broad enough to hold 2 pairs of lungs, and he seemed to want a double supply, for he was always puffing, blowing, and talking. He had droll, roguish eyes, with a network of wrinkles under them. A noteworthy detail was an earring, one only, which hung from the lobe of his left ear. What a contrast to the captain of the schooner, and how did two such dissimilar beings contrive to get on together? They had contrived it somehow, for they had been at sea in each other's company for 15 years, first in the brig Power, which had been replaced by the schooner Halbrane 6 years before the beginning of this story. Atkins had told Hurliguerly on his arrival that I would take passage on the Halbrane if Captain Len Guy consented to my doing so, and the boatswain presented himself on the following morning without any notice or introduction. He already knew my name, and he accosted me as follows: "Mr. Jeorling, I salute you." "I salute you in turn, my friend. What do you want?" "To offer you my services." "On what account?" "On account of your intention to embark on the Halbrane." "Who are you?" "I am Hurliguerly, the boatswain of the Halbrane, and besides, I am the faithful companion of Captain Len Guy, who will listen to me willingly, although he has the reputation of not listening to anybody." "Well, my friend, let us talk, if you are not required on board just now." "I have 2 hours before me, Mr. Jeorling. Besides, there's very little to be done to day. If you are free, as I am." He waved his hand towards the port. "Cannot we talk very well here?" I observed. "Talk, Mr. Jeorling, standing up, and our throats dry, when it is so easy to sit down in a corner of the Green Cormorant in front of 2 glasses of whisky." "I don't drink." "Well, then, I shall drink for both of us." "Oh, don't imagine you are dealing with a sot. No, never more than is good for me, but always as much." I followed the man to the tavern, and while Atkins was busy on the deck of the ship discussing the prices of his purchases and sales, we took our place in the eating room of his inn. And first I said to Hurliguerly, "It was on Atkins that I reckoned to introduce me to Captain Len Guy, for he knows him very intimately, if I am not mistaken." "Pooh! Atkins is a good sort, and the captain has an esteem for him, but he can't do what I can. Let me ask for you, Mr. Jeorling." "Is it so difficult a matter to arrange, boatswain? And is there not a cabin on board the Halbrane?" "The smallest would do for me, and I will pay." "All right, Mr. Jeorling. There is a cabin, which has never been used, and since you don't mind putting your hand in your pocket if you required. However, between ourselves, it will take somebody sharper than you think, and who isn't good old Atkins, to induce Captain Len Guy to take a passenger. Yes, indeed, it will take all the smartness of a good fellow who now drinks to your health, regretting that you don't return the compliment." What a wink it was that accompanied this sentiment! And then the man took a short black pipe out of the pocket of his jacket and smoked like a steamer in full blast. "Mr. Hurliguerly," said I. "Mr. Jeorling." "Why does your captain object to taking me on his ship?" "Because he does not intend to take anybody on board his ship. He never has taken a passenger." "But for what reason, I ask you?" "Oh, because he wants to go where he likes, to turn about if he pleases, and to go the other way without accounting for his motives to anybody. He never leaves these southern seas, Mr. Jeorling. We have been going these many years between Australia on the east and America on the west, from Hobart Town to the Kerguelens, to Tristan d'Acunha, to the Falklands, only taking time anywhere to sell our cargo, and sometimes dipping down into the Antarctic Sea. Under these circumstances, you understand, a passenger might be troublesome, and besides, who would care to embark on the Halbrane? She does not like to flout the breezes, and goes wherever the wind drives her." "The Halbrane positively leaves for the Kerguelens in 4 days?" "Certainly." "And this time she will sail westward for Tristan d'Acunha?" "Probably." "Well, then, that probability will be enough for me. and since you offer me your services, get Captain Len Guy to accept me as a passenger." "It is as good as done." "All right, Hurliguerly, and you shall have no reason to repent of it." "Ah, Mr. Jeorling," replied this singular mariner, shaking his head as though he had just come out of the sea, "I have never repented of anything, and I know well that I should not repent of doing you a service. Now, if you will allow me, I shall take leave of you, without waiting for Atkins to return and get on board." With this Hurliguerly swallowed his last glass of whisky at a gulp. I thought the glass would have gone down with the liquor, bestowed a patronizing smile on me, and departed. An hour later I met the innkeeper on the port, and told him what had occurred. "Ah, that Hurliguerly!" said he. "Always the old story. If you were to believe him, Captain Len Guy wouldn't blow his nose without consulting him. He's a queer fellow, Mr. Jeorling. Not bad, not stupid, but a great hand at getting hold of dollars or guineas. If you fall into his hands, mind your purse, button up your pocket, and don't let yourself be done. Thanks for the advice, Atkins. Tell me, you have been talking with Captain Len Guy. Have you spoken about me?" "Not yet, Mr. Jeorling. There's plenty of time. The Halbrane only just arrived, and—" "Yes, yes, I know. But you understand that I want to be certain as soon as possible." "There's nothing to fear. The matter will be all right. Besides, you would not be at a loss in any case. When the fishing season comes, there will be more ships in Christmas Harbour than there are houses around the Green Cormorant. Rely on me. I undertake your getting a passage." Now these were fair words, but, just as in the case of Hurliguerly, there was nothing in them. So, notwithstanding the fine promises of the two, I resolved to address myself personally to Len Guy, hard to get at though he might be, so soon as I should meet him alone. The next day, in the afternoon, I saw him on the quay, and approached him. It was plain that he would have preferred to avoid me. It was impossible that Captain Len Guy, who knew every dweller in the place, should not have known that I was a stranger, even supposing that neither of my would-be patrons had mentioned me to him. His attitude could only signify one of two things: either my proposal had been communicated to him, and that he did not intend to accede to it, or neither Hurliguerly nor Atkins had spoken to him since the previous day. In the latter case, if he held aloof from me, it was because of his morose nature. It was because he did not choose to enter into conversation with a stranger. At the moment I was about to accost him, the Halbrane's lieutenant rejoined his captain, and the latter availed himself of the opportunity to avoid me. He made a sign to the officer to follow him, and the two walked away at a rapid pace. "This is serious," said I to myself. "It looks as though I shall find it difficult to gain my point. But, after all, it only means delay. To morrow morning I will go on board the Halbrane, whether he likes it or whether he doesn't. This Len Guy will have to hear what I've got to say, and to give me an answer, yes or no. Besides, the captain of the Halbrane might come at dinner time to the Green Cormorant, where the ship's people usually took their meals when ashore. So I waited, and did not go to dinner until late. I was disappointed, however, for neither the captain nor any one belonging to the ship patronized the Green Cormorant that day. I had to dine alone, exactly as I had been doing every day for 2 months. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 3. Captain Len Guy. I slept ill. Again and again I dreamed that I was dreaming. Now this is an observation made by Edgar Poe. When one suspects that one is dreaming, the waking comes almost instantly. I woke then, and every time in a very bad humour with Captain Len Guy. The idea of leaving the Kerguelens on the Halbrane had full possession of me, and I grew more and more angry with her disobliging captain. In fact, I passed the night in a fever of indignation, and only recovered my temper with daylight. Nevertheless, I was determined to have an explanation with Captain Len Guy about his detestable conduct. Perhaps I should fail to get anything out of that human hedgehog, but at least I should have given him a piece of my mind. I went out at 8 o'clock in the morning. The weather was abominable. Rain mixed with snow, a storm coming over the mountains at the back of the bay from the west, clouds scurrying down from the lower zones, an avalanche of wind and water. It was like that Captain Len Guy had come ashore merely to enjoy such a wetting and blowing. No one on the quay? Of course not. As for getting on board the Halbrane, that could not be done without hailing one of her boats, and the boatswain would not venture to send it for me. Besides, I reflected, on his quarter-deck the captain is at home, and neutral ground is better for what I want to say to him. If he persists in his unjustifiable refusal, I will watch him this time, and if his boat touches the quay, he shall not succeed in avoiding me. I returned to the Green Cormorant, and took up my post behind the window panes, which were dimmed by the hissing rain. There I waited, nervous, impatient, and in a state of growing irritation. 2 hours wore away thus. Then, with the instability of the winds in the Kerguelens, the weather became calm before I did. I opened my window, and at the same moment a sailor stepped into one of the boats of the Halbrane, and laid hold of a pair of oars, while a second man seated himself in the back, but without taking the tiller ropes. The boat touched the landing place, and Captain Len Guy stepped on shore. In a few seconds I was out of the inn, and confronted him. "Sir," said I in a cold, hard tone. Captain Len Guy looked at me steadily, and I was struck by the sadness of his eyes, which were as black as ink. Then, in a very low voice, he asked, "You are a stranger?" "A stranger at the Kerguelens, yes." "Of English nationality?" "No, American." He saluted me, and I returned the curt gesture. "Sir," I resumed, "I believe Mr. Atkins of the Green Cormorant has spoken to you respecting a proposal of mine. That proposal, it seems to me, deserved a favourable reception on the part of a—" "The proposal to take passage on my ship?" interposed Captain Len Guy. "Precisely." "I regret, sir, I regret that I cannot agree to your request." "Will you tell me why?" "Because I am not in the habit of taking passengers. That is the first reason." "And the second, captain?" "Because the route of the Halbrane is never settled beforehand. She starts for one port and goes to another, just as I find it to my advantage. You must know that I am not in the service of a ship owner. My share in the schooner is considerable, and I have no one but myself to consult in respect to her." "Then it entirely depends on you to give me a passage?" "That is so, but I can only answer you by a refusal, to my extreme regret." "Perhaps you will change your mind, captain, when you know that I care very little what the destination of your schooner may be. It is not unreasonable to suppose that she will go somewhere." "Somewhere, indeed!" I fancied that Captain Len Guy threw a long look towards the southern horizon. To go here or to go there is almost a matter of indifference to me. What I desired above all was to get away from the Kerguelen at the first opportunity that should offer. Captain Len Guy made me no answer. He remained in silent thought, but did not endeavour to slip away from me. "You are doing me the honour to listen to me?" I asked him sharply. "Yes, sir." "I will then add that, if I am not mistaken, and if the route of your ship has not been altered, it was your intention to leave Christmas Harbour for Tristan d'Acunha." "Perhaps for Tristan d'Acunha, perhaps for the Cape, perhaps for the Falklands, perhaps for somewhere else." "Well then, Captain Guy, it is precisely elsewhere that I want to go," I replied ironically, and tried hard to control my irritation. Then a singular change took place in the demeanour of Captain Len Guy. His voice became more sharp and harsh. In very plain words he made me understand that it was quite useless to insist, that our interview had already lasted too long, that time pressed, and he had other business at the port. In short, that we had said all that we could have to say to each other. I had put out my arm to detain him, to seize him would be a more correct term, and the conversation, ill begun, seemed likely to end still more ill, when this odd person turned towards me and said in a milder tone, "Pray understand, sir, that I am very sorry to be unable to do what you ask, and to appear disobliging to an American, but I could not act otherwise. In the course of the voyage of the Halbrane, some unforeseen incident might occur to make the presence of a passenger inconvenient, even one so accommodating as yourself. Thus I might expose myself to the risk of being unable to profit by the chances which I seek. I have told you, captain, and I repeat it, that although my intention is to return to America and to Connecticut, I don't care whether I get there in 3 months or in 6, or by what route. It is all the same to me. And even were your schooner to take me to the Antarctic seas—" "The Antarctic seas!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy with a question in his tone, and his look searched my thoughts with the keenness of a dagger. "Why do you speak of the Antarctic seas?" he asked, taking my hand. "Well, just as I might have spoken of the Hyperborean seas, from whence an Irish poet has made Sebastian Cabot address some lovely verses to his lady, I spoke of the South Pole as I might have spoken of the North." Captain Len Guy did not answer, and I thought I saw tears glisten in his eyes. Then, as he thought he would escape from some harrowing recollection which my words had evoked, he said, "Who would venture to seek the South Pole?" "It would be difficult to reach, and the experiment would be of no practical use," I replied. "Nevertheless, there are men sufficiently adventurous to embark in such an enterprise." "Yes, adventurous is the word," muttered the captain. "And now," I resumed, "the United States is again making an attempt with Wilkes's fleet, the Vancouver, the Peacock, the Flying Fish, and others." "The United States, Mr. Jeorling? Do you mean to say that an expedition has been sent by the Federal Government to the Antarctic seas?" "The fact is certain, and last year, before I left America, I learned that the vessels had sailed. That was a year ago, and it is very possible that Wilkes has gone further than any of the preceding explorers." Captain Len Guy had relapsed into silence, and came out of his inexplicable musing only to say abruptly, "You come from Connecticut, sir?" "From Connecticut." "And more specifically?" "From Providence." "Do you know Nantucket Island?" "I have visited it several times." "You know, I think," said the captain, looking straight into my eyes, "that Nantucket Island was the birthplace of Arthur Gordon Pym, The hero of your famous romance writer, Edgar Poe. Yes, I remember that Poe's romance starts from Nantucket. Romance, you say? That was the word you used? Undoubtedly, captain. Yes, and that is what everybody says, but pardon me, I cannot stay any longer. I regret that I cannot alter my mind with respect to your proposal. But at any rate, you will only have a few days to wait. The season is about to open. Trading ships and whalers will put in at Christmas Harbour, and you will be able to make a choice, with the certainty of going to the port you want to reach. I am very sorry, sir, and I salute you." With these words Captain Len Guy walked quickly away, and the interview ended differently from what I had expected, that is to say, in formal, although polite, fashion. And there is no use in contending with the impossible. I gave up the hope of a passage on the Halbrane, but continued to feel angry with her intractable captain. And why should I not confess that my curiosity was aroused? I felt that there was something mysterious about this sullen mariner, and I should have liked to find out what it was. That day Atkins wanted to know whether Captain Len Guy had made himself less disagreeable. I had to acknowledge that I had been no more fortunate in my negotiations than my host himself, and the avowal surprised him not a little. He could not understand the captain's obstinate refusal, and, a fact which touched him more nearly, the Green Cormorant had not been visited by either Len Guy or his crew since the arrival of the Halbrane. The men were evidently acting upon orders. So far as Hurliguerly was concerned, it was easy to understand that after his imprudent advance he did not care to keep up useless relations with me. I knew not whether he had attempted to shake the resolution of his chief, but I was certain of one thing: if he had made any such effort, it had failed. During the 3 following days, the 10th, 11th, and 12th of August, the work of repairing and revictualling the schooner went on briskly, but all this was done with regularity, and without such noise and quarrelling as seamen at anchor usually indulge in. The Halbrane was evidently well commanded, her crew well kept in hand, discipline strictly maintained. The schooner was to sail on the 15th of August, and on the eve of that day I had no reason to think that Captain Len Guy had repented him of his categorical refusal. Indeed, I had made up my mind to the disappointment, and had no longer any angry feeling about it. When Captain Len Guy and myself met on the quay, we took no notice of each other. Nevertheless, I fancied there was some hesitation in his manner, as though he would have liked to speak to me. He did not do so, however, and I was not disposed to seek a further explanation. At 7 o'clock in the evening of the 14th, the island already being wrapped in darkness, I was walking on the port after I had dined, walking briskly too, for it was cold, although dry weather. The sky was studded with stars, and the air was very keen. I could not stay out long, and was returning to mine inn, when a man crossed my path, paused, came back, and stopped in front of me. It was the captain of the Halbrane. "Mr. Joerling," he began, "the Halbrane sails to morrow with the ebb tide." "What is the good of telling me that," I replied, "since you refuse?" "Sir, I have thought it over, and if you have not changed your mind, come on board at 7 o'clock." "Really, captain?" I replied. "I did not expect this relenting on your part." "I repeat that I have thought it over, and I add that the Halbrane shall proceed directly to Tristan d'Acunha. That will suit you, I suppose?" "To perfection, captain. To morrow morning at 7 o'clock I shall be on board." Your cabin is prepared. The cost of the voyage? We can settle that another time, answered the captain. And to your satisfaction. Until tomorrow, then. Until tomorrow. I stretched out my arm to shake hands with him upon our bargain. Perhaps he did not perceive my movement in the darkness. At all events, he made no response to it, but walked rapidly away and got into his boat. I was greatly surprised, and so was Atkins, when I found him in the eating room of the great Cormorant, and told him what had occurred. His comment upon it was characteristic. "This queer captain," he said, "is as full of whims as a spoilt child. It is to be hoped he will not change his mind again at the last moment." The next morning at daybreak I bade adieu to the Green Cormorant, and went down to the port with An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 4. From the Kerguelen Islands to Prince Edward Island. Never did a voyage begin more preposterously, or a passenger start in better spirits. The interior of the Halbrane corresponded with its exterior. Nothing could exceed the perfect order, the Dutch cleanliness of the vessel. The captain's cabin and that of the lieutenant, one on the port, the other on the starboard side, were fitted up with a narrow berth, a cupboard anything but capacious, an arm-chair, a fixed table, a lamp hung from the ceiling, various nautical instruments, a barometer, a thermometer, a chronometer, and a sextant in its oaken box. One of the two other cabins was prepared to receive me. It was 8 feet in length, 5 in breadth. I was accustomed to the exigencies of sea life, and could do with its narrow proportions, also with its furniture: a table, a cupboard, a cane-bottomed arm-chair, a washing-stand on an iron pedestal, and a berth to which a less accommodating passenger would doubtless have objected. The passage would be a short one, however, so I took possession of that cabin which I was to occupy for only 4, or at the worst 5 weeks, with entire content. The 8 men who composed the crew were named respectively Martin Holt, sailing master; Hardy, Rogers, Drap, Francis, Gratian, Berg, and Stern, sailors, all between 25 and 35 years old, all Englishmen, well trained, and remarkably well disciplined by a hand of iron. Let me set it down here at the beginning, the exceptionally able man whom they all obeyed at a word, a gesture, was not the captain of the Halbrane. That man was the second officer, James West, who was then 32 years of age. James West was born on the sea, and had passed his childhood on board a lighter belonging to his father, and on which the whole family lived. All his life he had breathed the salt air of the English Channel, the Atlantic, or the Pacific. He never went ashore except for the needs of his service, whether of the state or of trade. If he had to leave one ship for another, he merely shifted his canvas bag to the latter, from which he stirred no more. When he was not sailing in reality, he was sailing in his imagination. After having been ship's boy, novice, sailor, he became quartermaster, master, and finally lieutenant of the Halbrane, and he had already served for 10 years as second in command under Captain Len Guy. James West was not even ambitious of a higher rise. He did not want to make a fortune. He did not concern himself with the buying or selling of cargoes, but everything connected with that admirable instrument, a sailing ship, James West understood to perfection. The personal appearance of the lieutenant was as follows: middle height, slightly built, all nerves and muscles, strong limbs as agile as those of a gymnast, the true sailor's look, but of very unusual far-sightedness and surprising penetration, sunburnt face, hair thick and short, beardless cheeks and chin, regular features, the whole expression denoting energy, courage, and physical strength at their utmost tension. James West spoke but rarely, only when he was questioned. He gave his orders in a clear voice, not repeating them, but so as to be heard at once, and he was understood. I call attention to this typical officer of the merchant marine, who was devoted body and soul to Captain Len Guy, as to the schooner Halbrane. He seemed to be one of the essential organs of his ship, and if the Halbrane had a heart, it was in James West's breast that it beat. There is but one more person to be mentioned, the ship's cook, a negro from the African coast named Endicott, 30 years of age, who had held that post for 8 years. The boatswain and he were great friends, and indulged in frequent talks. Life on board was very regular, very simple, and its monotony was not without a certain charm. Sailing is repose in movement, a rocking in a dream, and I did not dislike my isolation. Of course, I should have liked to find out why Captain Len Guy had changed his mind with respect to me, but how was this to be done? To question the lieutenant would have been loss of time. Besides, was he in possession of the secrets of his chief? It was no part of his business to be so, and I observed that he did not occupy himself with anything outside of it. Not 10 words were exchanged between him and me during the 2 meals which we took in common daily. I must acknowledge, however, that I frequently caught the captain's eyes fixed upon me, as though he longed to question me, as though he had something to learn from me, whereas it was I, on the contrary, who had something to learn from him. But we were both silent. Had I felt the need of talking to somebody very strongly, I might have resorted to the boatswain, who was always disposed to chatter. But what had he to say that could interest me? He never failed to bid me good morning and good evening in most prolix fashion, but beyond these courtesies I did not feel disposed to go. The good weather lasted, and on the 18th of August, in the afternoon, the lookout discerned the mountains of the Crozet group. The next day we passed Possession Island, which was inhabited only in the fishing season. At this period the only dwellers there are flocks of penguins, and the birds which whalers call white pigeons. The approach to land is always interesting at sea. It occurred to me that Captain Len Guy might take this opportunity of speaking to his passenger, but he did not. We should see land, that is to say, the peaks of Marion and Prince Edward Islands, before arriving at Tristan d'Acunha, but it was there the Halbrane was to take in a fresh supply of water. I concluded, therefore, that the monotony of our voyage would continue unbroken to the end. But on the morning of the 20th of August, to my extreme surprise, Captain Len Guy came on deck, approached me, and said, speaking very low, "Sir, I have something to say to you." "I am ready to hear you, captain." "I have not spoken until to day, for I am naturally taciturn." Here he hesitated again, but after a pause continued with an effort, "Mr. Jeorling, have you tried to discover my reason for changing my mind on the subject of your passage?" "I have tried, but have not succeeded, captain. Perhaps I am not a compatriot of yours. It is precisely because you are an American that I decided in the end to offer you a passage on the Halbrane." "Because I am an American?" "Also because you came from Connecticut." "I don't understand." "You will understand if I add that I thought it possible, since you belong to Connecticut, since you have visited Nantucket Island, that you might have known the family of Arthur Gordon Pym." "The hero of Edgar Poe's romance?" "The same. His narrative was founded upon the manuscript in which the details of that extraordinary and disastrous voyage across the Antarctic Sea was related." I thought I must be dreaming when I heard Captain Len Guy's words. Edgar Poe's romance was nothing but a fiction, a work of imagination by the most brilliant of our American writers, and here was a sane man treating that fiction as a reality. I could not answer him. I was asking myself what manner of man was this one with whom I had to deal. "You have heard my question?" persisted the captain. Yes, captain, certainly, but I am not sure that I quite understand." "I will put it to you more plainly. I asked you whether in Connecticut you personally knew the Pym family who lived in Nantucket Island. Arthur Pym's father was one of the principal merchants there. He was a navy contractor. It was his son who embarked in the adventures which he related with his own lips to Edgar Poe." "Captain! Why, that story is due to the powerful imagination of our great poet. It is a pure invention." "So, then, you don't believe it, Mr. Jeorling?" said the captain, shrugging his shoulders 3 times. "Neither I nor any other person believes it, Captain Guy, and you are the first that I have heard maintain that it was anything but a mere romance." "Listen to me, then, Mr. Jeorling, for although this romance, as you call it, appeared only last year, it is none the less a reality. Although 11 years have elapsed since the facts occurred, they are none the less true, and we still await the word J of an enigma which will perhaps never be solved." Yes, he was mad, but by good fortune West was there to take his place as commander of the schooner. I had only to listen to him, and as I had read Poe's romance over and over again, I was curious to hear what the captain had to say about it. "And now," he resumed in a sharper tone, and with a shake in his voice which denoted a certain amount of nervous irritation, "it is possible that you did not know the Pym family, that you have never met them, either at Providence or at Nantucket?" "Or elsewhere." "Just so. But don't commit yourself by asserting that the Pym family never existed. That Arthur Gordon is only a fictitious person, and his voyage an imaginary one. Do you think any man, even your Edgar Poe, could have been capable of inventing, of creating. The increasing vehemence of Captain Len Guy warned me of the necessity of treating his monomania with respect, and accepting all he said without discussion. "Now," he proceeded, "please keep to the facts which I am about to state clearly in your mind. There is no disputing about facts. You may deduce any results from them you like. I hope you will not make me regret that I consented to give you a passage on the Halbrane." This was an effectual warning, so I made a sign of acquiescence. The matter promised to be curious. He went on: "When Edgar Poe's narrative appeared in 1838, I was at New York. I immediately started for Baltimore, where the writer's family lived. The grandfather had served as a quartermaster general during the War of Independence. You must admit, I suppose, the existence of the Poe family, although you deny that of the Pym family." I said nothing, and the captain continued, with a dark glance at me: "I inquired into certain matters relating to Edgar Poe. His abode was pointed out to me, and I called at the house. At first disappointment, he had left America, and I could not see him. Unfortunately, being unable to see Edgar Poe, I was unable to refer to Arthur Gordon Pym in the case. That bold pioneer of the Antarctic regions was dead, as the American poet had stated at the close of the narrative of his adventures. Gordon's death had already been made known to the public by the daily press." What Captain Len Guy said was true, but in common with all the readers of the romance I had taken this declaration for an artifice of the novelist. My notion was that, as he either could not or dared not wind up so extraordinary a work of imagination, Poe had given it to be understood that he had not received the last 3 chapters from Arthur Pym, whose life had ended under sudden and deplorable circumstances which Poe did not make known. "Then," continued the captain, "Edgar Poe being absent, Arthur Pym being dead, I had only one thing to do: to find the man who had been the fellow traveller of Arthur Pym, that Dirk Peters who had followed him to the very verge of the high latitudes, and whence they had both returned. How? This is not known. Did they come back in company? The narrative does not say, and there are obscure points in that part of it, as in many other places. However, Edgar Poe stated explicitly that Dirk Peters would be able to furnish information relating to the non communicated chapters, and that he lived at Illinois. I set out at once for Illinois. I arrived at Springfield. I inquired for this man, a half breed Indian. He lived in the hamlet of Vandalia. I went there, and met with a second disappointment. He was not there, or rather, Mr. Jeorling, he was no longer there. Some years before, this Dirk Peters had left Illinois, and even the United States, to go, nobody knows where. But I have talked at Vandalia with people who had known him, with whom he had lived, to whom he related his adventures, but did not explain the final issue. Of that he alone holds the secret." What? This Dirk Peters had really existed? He still lived? I was on the point of letting myself be carried away by the statements of the captain of the Halbrane. Yes, another moment, and in my turn I should have made a fool of myself. This poor mad fellow imagined that he had gone to Illinois and seen people at Vandalia who had known Dirk Peters, and that the latter had disappeared. No wonder, since he had never existed save in the brain of the novelist. Nevertheless, I did not want to vex Len Guy, and perhaps drive him still more mad. Accordingly, I appeared entirely convinced that he was speaking words of sober seriousness, even when he added, "You are aware that in the narrative mention is made by the captain of the schooner on which Arthur Pym had embarked, of a bottle containing a sealed letter, which was deposited at the foot of one of the Kerguelen peaks?" Yes, I recalled the incident. Well, then, in one of my latest voyages I sought for the place where that bottle ought to be. I found it, and the letter also. That letter stated that the captain and Arthur Pym intended to make every effort to reach the uttermost limits of the Antarctic Sea. You found that bottle? Yes. And the letter? Yes. I looked at Captain Len Guy. Like certain monomaniacs, he had come to believe in his own inventions. I was on the point of saying to him, "Show me that letter," but I thought better of it. Was he not capable of having written the letter himself? And then I answered, "It is much to be regretted, captain, that you were unable to come across Dirk Peters at Vandalia. He would at least have informed you under what conditions he and Arthur Pym returned from so far. Recollect now, in the last chapter but one they are both there. Their boat is in front of the thick curtain of white mist. It dashes into the gulf of the cataract just at the moment when a veiled human form rises. Then there is nothing more, nothing but two blank lines." "Decidedly, sir, it is much to be regretted that I could not lay my hand on Dirk Peters. It would have been interesting to learn what was the outcome of these adventures. But to my mind it would have been still more interesting to have ascertained the fate of the others." "The others?" I exclaimed most involuntarily. "Of whom do you speak?" "Of the captain and crew of the English schooner which picked up Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters after the frightful shipwreck of the Grampus, and brought them across the Polar Sea to Tsalal Island." "Captain," said I, just as though I entertained no doubt of the authenticity of Edgar Poe's romance, "is it not the case that all these men perished, some in the attack on the schooner, the others by the infernal device of the natives at Tsalal?" "Who can tell?" replied the captain, in a voice hoarse from emotion. "Who can say but that some of the unfortunate creatures survived, and contrived to escape from the natives?" "In any case," I replied, "it would be difficult to admit that those who had survived could still be living." "And why?" "Because the facts we are discussing are 11 years old." "Sir," replied the captain, "since Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters were able to advance beyond Tsalal Island, further than the 83rd parallel, since they found means of living in the midst of those Antarctic lands, why should not their companions, if they were not all killed by the natives, if they were so fortunate as to reach the neighbouring islands sighted during the voyage, why not those unfortunate countrymen of mine have contrived to live there? Why should they not still be there, awaiting their deliverance?" "Your pity leads you astray, captain," I replied. "It would be impossible." "Impossible, sir! And in fact, on indisputable evidence, appealed to the whole civilized world, if a material proof of the existence of these unhappy men, imprisoned at the ends of the earth, were furnished, who would venture to meet those who would fain go to their aid with the cry of 'Impossible'?" Was it a sentiment of humanity, exaggerated to the point of madness, that had roused the interest of this strange man in those shipwrecked folk, who never had suffered shipwreck for the good reason that they had never existed? Captain Len Guy approached me anew, laid his hand on my shoulder, and whispered in my ear, "No, sir, no. The last word has not been said concerning the crew of the Jane." Then he promptly withdrew. The Jane was, in Edgar Poe's romance, the name of the ship which had rescued Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters from the wreck of the Grampus, and Captain An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 5. Edgar Poe's Romance. In this chapter I have to give a brief summary of Edgar Poe's romance, which was published at Richmond under the title of The Adventures of Arthur Gordon Pym. We shall see whether there was any room for doubt that the adventures of this hero of romance were imaginary. But indeed, among the multitude of Poe's readers, was there ever one, with the sole exception of Len Guy, who believed them to be real? The story is told by the principal personage. Arthur Pym states in the preface that on his return from his voyage to the Antarctic seas, he met, among the Virginian gentlemen who took an interest in geographical discoveries, Edgar Poe, who was then editor of the Southern Literary Messenger at Richmond, and that he authored the latter to publish the first part of his adventures in that journal under the cloak of fiction. That portion having been favourably received, a volume containing the complete narrative was issued with the signature of Edgar Poe. Arthur Gordon Pym was born at Nantucket, where he attended the Bedford School until he was 16 years old. Having left that school for Mr. Ronald's, he formed a friendship with one Augustus Barnard, the son of a ship's captain. This youth, who was 18, had already accompanied his father on a whaling expedition in the southern seas, and his yarns concerning that maritime adventure fired the imagination of Arthur Pym. Thus it was the association of these youths gave rise to Pym's irresistible vocation to adventurous voyaging, and to the instinct that especially attracted him towards the high zones of the Antarctic regions. The first exploit of Augustus Barnard and Arthur Pym was an excursion on board a little sloop, the Ariel, a two-decked boat which belonged to the Pyms. One evening the two youths, both being very tipsy, embarked secretly, in cold October weather, and boldly set sail in a strong breeze from the south-west. The Ariel, aided by the ebb tide, had already lost sight of land when a violent storm arose. The imprudent young fellows were still intoxicated. No one was at the helm, not a reef was in the sail. The masts were carried away by the furious gusts, and the wreck was driven before the wind. Then came a great ship which passed over the Ariel as the Ariel would have passed a floating feather. Arthur Pym gives the fullest details of the rescue of his companion and himself after this collision, under conditions of extreme difficulty. At length, thanks to the second officer of the Penguin, from New London, which arrived on the scene of the catastrophe, the comrades were picked with life all but extinct, and taken back to Nantucket. This adventure, to which I cannot deny an appearance of veracity, was an ingenious preparation for the chapters that were to follow, and indeed up to the day on which Pym penetrates into the Polar Circle, the narrative might conceivably be regarded as authentic. But beyond the Polar Circle, above the austral icebergs, it is quite another thing, and if the author's work be not one of pure imagination, I am, well, of any other nationality than my own. Let us get on. Their first adventure had not cooled the two youths, and 8 months after the affair of the Ariel, June 1827, the brig Grampus was fitted out by the house of Lloyd and Vredenburgh for whaling in the southern seas. This brig was an old, ill-repaired craft, and Mr. Barnard, the father of Augustus, was its skipper. His son, who was to accompany him on the voyage, strongly urged Arthur to go with him, and the latter would have asked nothing better, but he knew that his family, and especially his mother, would never consent to let him go. This obstacle, however, could not stop a youth not much given to submit to the wishes of his parents. His head was full of the entreaties and persuasions of his companion, and he determined to embark secretly on the Grampus, for Mr. Barnard would not have authorized him to defy the prohibition of his family. He announced that he had been invited to pass a few days with a friend at New Bedford, took leave of his parents, and left his home. 48 hours before the brig was to sail, he slipped on board unperceived, and got into a hiding place which had been prepared for him, unknown alike to Mr. Barnard and the crew. The cabin occupied by Augustus communicated by a trap door with the hold of the Grampus, which was crowded with barrels, bales, and the innumerable components of a cargo. Through the trap door Arthur Pym reached his hiding place, which was a huge wooden chest with a sliding side to it. This chest contained a mattress, blankets, a jar of water, ship's biscuit, smoked sausage, a roast quarter of mutton, a few bottles of cordials and liqueurs, and also writing materials. Arthur Pym, supplied with a lantern, candles, and tinder, remained 3 days and nights in his retreat. Augustus Barnard had not been able to visit him until just before the Grampus set sail. An hour later, Arthur Pym began to feel the rolling and pitching of the brig. He was very uncomfortable in the chest, so he got out of it, and in the dark, while holding on by a rope which was stretched across the hold to the trap of his friend's cabin, he was violently seasick in the midst of the chaos. Then he crept back into his chest, ate, and fell asleep. Several days elapsed without the reappearance of Augustus Barnard. Either he had not been able to get down into the hold again, or he had not ventured to do so, fearing to betray the presence of Arthur Pym, and thinking the moment for confessing everything to his father had not yet come. Arthur Pym, meanwhile, was beginning to suffer from the hot and vitiated atmosphere of the hold. Terrible nightmares troubled his sleep. He was conscious of raving, and in vain sought some place amid the mass of cargo where he might breathe a little more easily. In one of these fits of delirium he imagined that he was gripped in the claws of an African lion, and in a paroxysm of terror he was about to betray himself by screaming, when he lost consciousness. The fact is that he was not dreaming at all. It was not a lion that Arthur Pym felt crouching upon his chest. It was his own dog Tiger, a young Newfoundland. The animal had been smuggled on board by Augustus Barnard, unperceived by anybody. This, at least, is an unlikely occurrence. At the moment of Arthur's coming out of his swoon, the faithful Tiger was licking his face and hands with lavish affection. Now the prisoner had a companion. Unfortunately, the said companion had drunk the contents of the water jar while Arthur was unconscious, and when Arthur Pym felt thirsty he discovered that there was not a drop to drink. His lantern had gone out during his prolonged faint. He could not find the candles and the tinder box, and then he resolved to rejoin Augustus Barnard at all hazards. He came out of the chest, and although faint from inanition and trembling with weakness, he felt his way in the direction of the trap door by means of the rope. But while he was approaching, one of the bales of cargo, shifted by the rolling of the ship, fell down and blocked up the passage. With immense but quite useless exertion he contrived to get over this obstacle, but when he reached the trap door under Augustus Barnard's cabin he failed to raise it, and on slipping the blade of his knife through one of the joints he found that a heavy mass of iron was placed upon the trap, as though it were intended to condemn him beyond hope. He had to renounce his attempt and drag himself back towards the chest, on which he fell, exhausted, while Tiger covered him with caresses. The master and the dog were desperately thirsty, and when Arthur stretched out his hand he found Tiger lying on his back with his paws up and his hair on end. He then felt Tiger all over, and his hand encountered a string passed along the dog's body. A strip of paper was fastened to the string under his left shoulder. Arthur Pym had reached the last stage of weakness. Intelligence was almost extinct. However, after several fruitless attempts to procure light, he succeeded in rubbing the paper with a little phosphorus. The details given in Edgar Poe's narrative are curiously minute at this point. And then, by the glimmer that lasted less than a second, he discerned just 7 words at the end of a sentence. Terrifying words these were: blood. Remain hidden. Life depends upon it. What did these words mean? Let us consider the situation of Arthur Pym at the bottom of the ship's hold, between the boards of a chest, without light, without water, with only ardent liquor to quench his thirst, and this warning to remain hidden, preceded by the word blood. That supreme word, king of words, so full of mystery, of suffering, of terror. Had there been strife on board the Grampus? Had the brig been attacked by pirates? Had the crew mutinied? How long had this state of things lasted? It might be thought that the marvellous poet had exhausted the resources of his imagination in the terror of such a situation, but it was not so. There is more to come. Arthur Pym lay stretched upon his mattress, incapable of thought, in a sort of lethargy. Suddenly he became aware of a singular sound, a kind of continuous whistling breathing. It was Tiger, panting. Tiger, with the eyes that glared in the midst of the darkness. Tiger, with gnashing teeth. Tiger, gone mad. Another moment and the dog had sprung upon Arthur Pym, who, wound up to the highest pitch of horror, recovered sufficient strength to ward off his fangs, and wrapping around him a blanket which Tiger had torn with his white teeth, he slipped out of the chest, and shut the sliding side upon the snapping and struggling brute. Arthur Pym contrived to slip through the stowage of the hold, but his head swam, and falling against a bale, he let his knife drop from his hand. Just as he felt himself breathing his last sigh, he heard his name pronounced, and a bottle of water was held to his lips. He swallowed the whole of its contents, and experienced the most exquisite of pleasures. A few minutes later, Augustus Barnard, seated with his comrade in a corner of the hold, told him all that had occurred on board the brig. Up to this point, I repeat, the story is admissible, but we have not yet come to the events which surpass all probability by their marvellousness. The crew of the Grampus numbered 36 men, including the Barnards, father and son. After the brig had put to sea on the 20th of June, Augustus Barnard had made several attempts to rejoin Arthur Pym in his hiding place, but in vain. On the third day a mutiny broke out on board, headed by the ship's cook, a negro like our Endicott, but he, let me say at once, would never have thought of heading a mutiny. Numerous incidents are related in the romance. The massacre of most of the sailors who remained faithful to Captain Barnard, then the turning adrift of the captain and 4 of those men in a small whaler's boat when the ship was abreast of the Bermudas. These unfortunate persons were never heard of again. Augustus Barnard would not have been spared, but for the intervention of the sailing master of the Grampus. This sailing master was a half-breed named Dirk Peters, and was the person whom Captain Len Guy had gone to look for in Illinois. The Grampus then took a south-east course under the command of the mate, who intended to pursue the occupation of piracy in the southern seas. These events having taken place, Augustus Barnard would have again joined Arthur Pym, but he had been shut up in the forecastle in irons, and told by the ship's cook that he would not be allowed to come out until the brig should no longer be a brig. Nevertheless, a few days afterwards, Augustus contrived to get rid of his fetters, to cut through the thin partition between him and the hold, and, followed by Tiger, he tried to reach his friend's hiding place. He could not succeed, but the dog had scented Arthur Pym, and this suggested to Augustus the idea of fastening a note to Tiger's neck, bearing the words: "I scrawl this with blood. Remain hidden. Your life depends upon it." This note, as we have already learned, Arthur Pym had received. Just as he had arrived at the last extremity of distress, his friend reached him. Augustus added that discord reigned among the mutineers. Some wanted to take the Grampus towards the Cape Verde Islands. Others, and Dirk Peters was one of this number, were bent on sailing to the Pacific Isles. Tiger was not mad. He was only suffering from terrible thirst, and soon recovered when it was relieved. The cargo of the Grampus was so badly stowed away that Arthur Pym was in constant danger from the shifting of the bales, and Augustus, at all risks, helped him to remove to a corner of the 'tween decks. The half-breed continued to be very friendly with the son of Captain Barnard, so that the latter began to consider whether the sailing master might not be counted on in an attempt to regain possession of the ship. They were just 30 days out from Nantucket when, on the 4th of July, an angry dispute arose among the mutineers about a little brig signalled in the offing, which some of them wanted to take and others would have allowed to escape. In this quarrel a sailor belonging to the cook's party, to which Dirk Peters had attached himself, was mortally injured. There was now only 13 men on board, counting Arthur Pym. Under these circumstances a terrible storm arose, and the Grampus was mercilessly knocked about. This storm raged until the 9th of July, and on that day, Dirk Peters having manifested an intention of getting rid of the mate, Augustus Barnard readily assured him of his assistance, without, however, revealing the fact of Arthur Pym's presence on board. Next day one of the cook's adherents, a man named Rogers, died in convulsions, and, beyond all doubt, of poison. Only 4 of the cook's party then remained. Of these Dirk Peters was one. The mate had 5, and would probably end by carrying the day over the cook's party. There was not an hour to lose. The half breed, having informed Augustus Barnard that the moment for action had arrived, the latter told him the truth about Arthur Pym. While the two were in consultation upon the means to be employed for regaining possession of the ship, a tempest was raging, and presently a gust of irresistible force struck the Grampus and flung her upon her side, so that, on righting herself, she shipped a tremendous sea, and there was considerable confusion on board. This offered a favourable opportunity for beginning the struggle, although the mutineers had made peace amongst themselves. The latter numbered 9 men, while the half-breed's party consisted only of himself, Augustus Barnard, and Arthur Pym. The ship's master possessed only 2 pistols and a hanger. It was therefore necessary to act with prudence. Then did Arthur Pym, whose presence on board the mutineers did not suspect, conceive the idea of a trick which had some chance of succeeding. The body of the poisoned sailor was still lying on the deck. He thought it likely, if he were to put on the dead man's clothes, and appear suddenly in the midst of those superstitious sailors, that their terror would place them at the mercy of Dirk Peters. It was still dark when the half-breed went softly towards the ship's stern, and, exerting his prodigious strength to the utmost, threw himself upon the man at the wheel and flung him over the poop. Augustus Barnard and Arthur Pym joined him instantly, each armed with a belaying pin. Leaving Dirk Peters in the place of the steersman, Arthur Pym, so disguised as to present himself the appearance of the dead man, and his comrade posted themselves close to the head of the forecastle gangway. The mate, the ship's cook, and all the others were there, some sleeping, the others drinking or talking. Guns and pistols were within reach of their hands. The tempest raged furiously. It was almost impossible to stand on the deck. At that moment the mate gave the order for Augustus Barnard and Dirk Peters to be brought to the forecastle. This order was transmitted to the man at the helm, no other than Dirk Peters, who went down, accompanied by Augustus Barnard, and almost simultaneously Arthur Pym made his appearance. The effect of the apparition was prodigious. The mate, terrified on beholding the resurrected sailor, sprang up, beat the air with his hands, and fell down dead. Then Dirk Peters rushed upon the others, seconded by Augustus Barnard, Arthur Pym, and the dog Tiger. In a few moments all were strangled or knocked on the head, save Richard Parker, the sailor, whose life was spared. And now, while the tempest was still in full force, only 4 men were left to work the brig, which was labouring terribly with 7 feet of water in her hold. They had to cut down the mainmast, and, when morning came, the mizzen. That day was truly awful. The night was more awful still. If Dirk Peters and his companions had not lashed themselves securely to the remains of the rigging, they must have been carried away by a tremendous sea, which drove in the hatches of the Grampus. Then follows in the romance a minute record of the series of incidents ensuing upon this situation, from the 14th of July to the 7th of August. the fishing for victuals in the submerged hold, the coming of a mysterious brig laden with corpses, which poisoned the atmosphere and passed on like a huge coffin, the sport of a wind of death, the torments of hunger and thirst, the impossibility of reaching the provision store, the drawing of lots by straws, the shortest gave Richard Parker to be sacrificed for the life of the other three, the death of that unhappy man who was killed by Dirk Peters and devoured, lastly, the finding in the hold of a jar of olives and a small turtle. Owing to the displacement of her cargo, the Grampus rolled and pitched more and more. The frightful heat caused the torture of thirst to reach the extreme limit of human endurance, and on the 1st of August Augustus Barnard died. On the 3rd the brig foundered in the night, and Arthur Pym and the half-breed, crouching upon the upturned keel, were reduced to feed upon the barnacles with which the bottom was covered, in the midst of a crowd of waiting, watching sharks. Finally, after the shipwrecked mariners of the Grampus had drifted no less than 25 degrees towards the south, they were picked up by the schooner Jane, of Liverpool, Captain William Guy. Evidently, reason is not outraged by an admission of the reality of these facts, although the situations are strained to the utmost limits of possibility. But that does not surprise us, for the writer is the American magician-poet, Edgar Poe. But from this moment onwards we shall see that no semblance of reality exists in the succession of incidents. Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters were well treated on board the English schooner Jane. In a fortnight, having recovered from the effects of their sufferings, they remembered them no more. With alternations of fine and bad weather, the Jane sighted Prince Edward's Island on the 13th of October, then the Crozet Islands, and afterwards the Kerguelens, which I had left 11 days ago. 3 weeks were employed in chasing sea calves. These furnished the Jane with a goodly cargo. It was during this time that the captain of the Jane buried the bottle in which his namesake of the Halbrane claims to have found a letter containing William Guy's announcement of his intention to visit the austral seas. On the 12th of November the schooner left the Kerguelens, and after a brief stay at Tristan d'Acunha she sailed to reconnoitre the auroras in 35 degrees 15 minutes of south latitude and 37 degrees 38 minutes of west longitude. But these islands were not to be found, and she did not find them. On the 12th of December the Jane headed towards the Antarctic pole. On the 26th the first icebergs came in sight beyond the 73rd degree. From the 1st to the 14th of January, 1828, the movements were difficult. The polar circle was passed in the midst of ice floes. The iceberg's point was doubled, and the ship sailed on the surface of an open sea, the famous open sea where the temperature is 47 degrees Fahrenheit and the water is 34 degrees. Edgar Poe, everyone will allow, gives free rein to his fancy at this point. No navigator had ever reached latitudes so high, not even James Weddell of the British Navy, who did not get beyond the 74th parallel in 1822. But the achievement of the Jane, although difficult of belief, is trifling in comparison with the succeeding incidents which Arthur Pym, or rather Edgar Poe, relates with simple earnestness. In fact, he entertained no doubt of reaching the pole itself. In the first place, not a single iceberg is to be seen on this fantastic sea. Innumerable flocks of birds skim its surface. Among them is a pelican which is shot. On a floating piece of ice is a bear of the Arctic species and of gigantic size. At last, land is signalled. It is an island of a league in circumference, to which the name of Bennet Islet was given, in honour of the captain's partner in the ownership of the Jane. Naturally, in proportion as the schooner sailed southward, the variation of the compass became less, while the temperature became milder, with the sky always clear and a uniform northerly breeze. Needless to add that in that latitude and in the month of January there was no darkness. The Jane pursued her adventurous course until, on the 18th of January, land was sighted in latitude 83° 20' and longitude 43° 5'. This proved to be an island belonging to a numerous group scattered about in a westerly direction. The schooner approached and anchored off the shore. Arms were placed in the boats, and Arthur Pym got into one of the latter with Dirk Peters. The men rowed shorewards, but were stopped by 4 canoes carrying armed men. "New men," the narrative calls them. These men showed no hostile intentions, but cried out continuously "Anamoo" and "Lama Lama." When the canoes were alongside the schooner, the chief, Too Wit, was permitted to go on board with 20 of his companions. There was profound astonishment on their part then, for they took the ship for a living creature, and lavished caresses on the rigging, the masts, and the bulwarks. Steering between the reefs by these natives, she crossed a bay with a bottom of black sand, and cast anchor within a mile of the beach. Then William Guy, leaving the hostages on board, stepped ashore amid the rocks. If Arthur Pym is to be believed, this was Tsalal Island. Its trees resembled none of the species in any other zone of our planet. The composition of the rocks revealed a stratification unknown to modern mineralogists. Over the bed of the streams ran a liquid substance without any appearance of limpidity, streaked with distinct veins, which did not reunite by immediate cohesion when they were parted by the blade of a knife. Klock Klock, which we are obliged to describe as the chief town of the island, consisted of wretched huts entirely formed of black skins. It possessed domestic animals resembling the common pig, a sort of sheep with a black fleece, 20 kinds of fowls, tame albatross, ducks, and large turtles in great numbers. Arriving at Klock Klock, Captain William Guy and his companions found a population, which Arthur Pym estimated at 10,000 souls, men, women, and children, if not to be feared, at least to be kept at a distance, so noisy and demonstrative they were. Finally, after a long halt at the hut of Too Wit, the strangers returned to the shore, where the bêche de mer, the favourite food of the Chinese, would provide enormous cargoes, for the succulent mollusk is more abundant there than in any other part of the austral regions. Captain William Guy immediately endeavoured to come to an understanding with Too Wit on this matter, requesting him to authorize the construction of sheds in which some of the men of the Jane might prepare the bêche de mer, while the schooner should hold on her course towards the Pole. Too Wit accepted this proposal willingly, and made a bargain by which the natives were to give their labour in the gathering in of the precious mollusk. At the end of the month, the sheds being finished, 3 men were told off to remain at Tsalal. The natives had not given the strangers cause to entertain the slightest suspicion of them. Before leaving the place, Captain William Guy wished to return once more to the village of Klock Klock, having from prudent motives left 6 men on board, the guns charged, the bulwark nettings in their place, and the anchor hanging at the forepeak. In a word, all in readiness to oppose an approach of the natives. Too Wit, escorted by 100 warriors, came out to meet the visitors. Captain William Guy and his men, although the place was propitious to an ambuscade, walked in close order, each pressing upon each other. On the right, a little in advance, were Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, and a sailor named Allen. Having reached a spot where a fissure traversed the hillside, Arthur Pym turned into it in order to gather some hazel nuts which hung in clusters upon stunted bushes. Having done this, he was returning to the path, when he perceived that Allen and the half breed had accompanied him. They were all three approaching the mouth of the fissure, when they were thrown down by a sudden and violent shock. At the same moment the crumbling masses of the hill slid down upon them, and they instantly concluded that they were doomed to be buried alive. Alive, all three? No. Allen had been so deeply covered by the sliding soil that he was already smothered, but Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters contrived to drag themselves on their knees, and opening a way with their bowie knives to a projecting mass of harder clay which had resisted the movement from above, and from thence they climbed to a natural platform at the extremity of a wooded ravine. Above them they could see the blue sky roof, and from their position were enabled to survey the surrounding country. An artificial landslip, cunningly contrived by the natives, had taken place. Captain William Guy and his 28 companions had disappeared. They were crushed beneath more than 1,000,000 tons of earth and stones. The plain was swarming with natives who had come, no doubt, from the neighbouring islets, attracted by the prospect of pillaging the Jane. 70 boats were being paddled towards the ship. The 6 men on board fired on them, but their aim was uncertain in the first volley. A second, in which mitraille and grooved bullets were used, produced a terrible effect. Nevertheless, the Jane being boarded by the swarming islanders, her defenders were massacred, and she was set on fire. Finally a terrific explosion took place. The fire had reached the powder store, killing 1,000 natives and mutilating as many more, while the others fled, uttering the cry of Tekeli Tekeli. During the following week Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, living on nuts and bitterns' flesh, escaped discovery by the natives, who did not suspect their presence. They found themselves at the bottom of a sort of dark abyss, including several plains, but without issue, hollowed out from the hillside, and of great extent. The 2 men could not live in the midst of these successive abysses, and after several attempts they let themselves slide on one of the slopes of the hill. Instantly 6 savages rushed upon them, but thanks to their pistols and the extraordinary strength of the half breed, 4 of the assailants were killed. The 5th was dragged away by the fugitives, who reached a boat which had been pulled up on the beach and was laden with 3 huge turtles. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 6. An Ocean Waif. The navigation of the Halbrane went on prosperously with the help of the sea and the wind. In 15 days, if this state of things lasted, she might reach Tristan d'Acunha. Captain Len Guy left the working of the ship to James West, and well might he do so. There was nothing to fear with such a seaman as he. "Our lieutenant has not his match afloat," said Hurliguerly to me one day. "He ought to be in command of a flagship." "Indeed," I replied, "he seems to be a true son of the sea." "And then our Halbrane, what a craft! Congratulate yourself, Mr. Joerling, and congratulate yourself also that I succeeded in bringing the captain to change his mind about you." "If it was you who obtained that result, boatswain, I thank you heartily." "And so you ought, for he was plaguily against it, was our captain, in spite of all old man Atkins could say. But I managed to make him hear reason." "I shan't forget it, boatswain. I shan't forget it, since, thanks to your intervention, instead of moping at Kerguelen, I hope shortly to get within sight of Tristan d'Acunha." "In a few days, Mr. Jeorling. Only think, sir, according to what I hear tell, they are making ships in England and America, with machines in their insides, and wheels which they use as a duck uses its paddles. All right, we shall know what's the good of them when they come into use. My notion is, however, that those ships will never be able to fight with a fine frigate sailing with a fresh breeze." It was the 3rd of September. If nothing occurred to delay us, our schooner would be in sight of port in 3 days. The chief island of the group is visible on clear days at a great distance. That day, between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning, I was walking backwards and forwards on the deck, on the windward side. We were sliding smoothly over the surface of an undulating sea. The Halbrane resembled an enormous bird, one of the gigantic albatross kind described by Arthur Pym, which had spread its sail-like wings, and was carrying a whole ship's crew towards space. James West was looking out through his glasses to starboard at an object floating 2 or 3 miles away, and several sailors hanging over the side were also curiously observing it. I went forward and looked attentively at the object. It was an irregularly formed mass about 12 yards in length, and in the middle of it there appeared a shining lump. "That is no whale," said Martin Holt, the sailing master. "It would have blown once or twice since we have been looking at it." "Certainly," assented Hardy. "Perhaps it is the carcass of some deserted ship." "May the devil send it to the bottom!" cried Roger. "It would be a bad job to come up against it in the dark. It might send us down before we could know what had happened." "I believe you," added Drap. "And these derelicts are more dangerous than a rock, for they are now here and again there, and there is no avoiding them." Hurliguerly came up at this moment, and planted his elbows on the bulwark alongside of mine. "What do you think of it, boatswain?" I asked. "It is my opinion, Mr. Jeorling," replied the boatswain, "that what we see there is neither a blower nor a wreck, but merely a lump of ice." "Hurliguerly is right," said James West. "It is a lump of ice, a piece of an iceberg which the currents have carried hither." "What?" said I. "To the 45th parallel?" "Yes, sir," answered West. "That has occurred, and the ice sometimes gets up as high as the Cape. If we are to take the word of a French navigator, Captain Blosseville, who met one at this height in 1828." "Then this mass will melt before long," I observed, feeling not a little surprised that West had honoured me by so lengthy a reply. "It must indeed be dissolved in great part already," he continued, "and what we see is the remains of a mountain of ice which must have weighed millions of tons." Captain Len Guy now appeared, and perceiving the group of sailors around West, he came forward. A few words were exchanged in a low tone between the captain and the lieutenant, and the latter passed his glass to the former, who turned it upon the floating object, now at least a mile nearer to us. "It is ice," said he, "and it is lucky it is dissolving. The Halbrane might have come to serious grief by collision with it in the night." I was struck by the fixity of his gaze upon the object, whose nature he had so promptly declared. He continued to contemplate it for several minutes, and I guessed what was passing in the mind of the man under the obsession of a fixed idea. This fragment of ice, torn from the southern icebergs, came from those waters wherein his thoughts continually ranged. He wanted to see it more near, perhaps at close quarters. It might be to take away some bits of it. At an order from west the schooner was directed towards the floating mass. Presently we were within 2 cable lengths, and I could examine it. The mound in the centre was melting rapidly. Before the end of the day nothing would remain of the fragment of ice which had been carried by the currents so high up as the 45th parallel. Captain Len Guy gazed at it steadily, but he now needed no glass, and presently we all began to distinguish a second object, which little by little detached itself from the mass, according as the melting process went on, a black shape stretched on the white ice. What was our surprise mingled with horror when we first saw an arm, then a leg, then a trunk, then a head appear, forming a human body, not in a state of nakedness, but clothed in dark garments. For a moment I even thought that the limbs moved, that the hands were stretched towards us. The crew uttered a simultaneous cry. No, this body was not moving, but it was slowly slipping off the icy surface. I looked at Captain Len Guy. His face was as livid as that of the corpse that had drifted down from the far latitudes of the austral zone. What could be done was done to recover the body of the unfortunate man, and who can tell whether a faint breath of life did not animate it even then? In any case his pockets might perhaps contain some document that would enable his identity to be established. Then, accompanied by a last prayer, those human remains should be committed to the depths of the ocean, the cemetery of sailors who die at sea. A boat was let down. I followed it with my eyes as it neared the side of the ice fragment eaten by the waves. Hurliguerly set foot upon a spot which still offered some resistance. Gratian got out after him, while Francis kept the boat fast by the chain. The two crept along the ice until they reached the corpse, then drew it to them by the arms and legs, and so got it to the boat. A few strokes of the oars and the boatswain had rejoined the schooner. The corpse, completely frozen, having been laid at the foot of the mizzen mast, Captain Len Guy approached and examined it long and closely, as though he sought to recognize it. It was the corpse of a sailor, dressed in coarse stuff, woollen trousers, and a patched jersey. A belt encircled his waist twice. His death had evidently occurred some months previously, perhaps very soon after the unfortunate man had been carried away by the drift. He was about 40, with slightly grizzled hair, a mere skeleton covered with skin. He must have suffered agonies of hunger. Captain Len Guy lifted up the hair, which had been preserved by the cold, raised the head, gazed upon the scaled eyelids, and finally said with a sort of sob, "Patterson, Patterson." "Patterson?" I exclaimed. The name, common as it was, touched some chord in my memory. When had I heard it uttered? Had I read it anywhere? At this moment James West, on a hint from the boatswain, searched the pockets of the dead man, and took out of them a knife, some string, an empty tobacco box, and lastly a leather pocket book, furnished with a metallic pencil. "Give me that," said the captain. Some of the leaves were covered with writing, almost entirely effaced by the damp. He found, however, some words on the last page which were still legible. and my emotion may be imagined when I heard him read aloud in a trembling voice: "The Jane, Tsalal Island, by 83, there, 11 years. Captain, 5 sailors surviving. Hasten to bring them aid." And under these lines was a name, a signature, the name of Patterson. Then I remembered. Patterson was the second officer of the Jane, the mate of that schooner which had picked up Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters on the wreck of the Grampus, the Jane having reached Tsalal Island, the Jane which was attacked by natives and blown up in the midst of those waters. So then it was all true? Edgar Poe's work, that of a historian, not writer of romance? Arthur Gordon Pym's journal had actually been confided to him. Direct relations had been established between them. Arthur Pym existed, or rather he had existed. He was a real being, and he had died by a sudden and deplorable death under circumstances not revealed before he had completed the narrative of his extraordinary voyage. And what parallel had he reached on leaving Tsalal Island with his companion Dirk Peters, and how had both of them been restored to their native land, America? I thought my head was turning, that I was going mad. I, who accused Captain Guy of being insane! No, I had not heard right. I had misunderstood. This was a mere phantom of my fancy. And yet, how was I to reject the evidence found on the body of the mate of the Jane, that Patterson whose words were supported by ascertained dates? And above all, how could I retain a doubt after James West, who was the most self-possessed among us, had succeeded in deciphering the following fragments of sentences: "Drifting since the 3rd of June north of Tsalal Island. Still there. Captain William Guy and 5 of the men of the Jane. The piece of ice I am on is drifting across the iceberg. Food will soon fail me. Since the 13th of June, my last resources exhausted. Today, 16th of June, I am going to die." So then, for nearly 3 months Patterson's body had lain on the surface of this ice waif, which we An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 7. Tristan d'Acunha. 4 days later the Halbrane neared that curious island of Tristan d'Acunha, which may be described as the big boiler of the African seas. By that time I had come to realize that the hallucination of Captain Len Guy was a truth, and that he and the captain of the Jane, also a reality, were connected with each other by this ocean waif from the authentic expedition of Arthur Pym. My last doubts were buried in the depths of the ocean with the body of Patterson. And now what was Captain Len Guy going to do? There was not a shadow of doubt on that point. He would take the Halbrane to Tsalal Island, as marked upon Patterson's note book. His lieutenant, James West, would go whithersoever he was ordered to go. His crew would not hesitate to follow him, and would not be stopped by any fear of passing the limits assigned to human power, for the soul of their captain and the strength of their lieutenant would be in them. This, then, was the reason why Captain Len Guy refused to take passengers on board his ship, and why he had told me that his routes never were certain. He was always hoping that an opportunity for venturing into the sea of ice might arise. Who could tell, indeed, whether he would not have sailed for the south at once, without putting in at Tristan d'Acunha, if he had not wanted water? After what I had said before I went on board the Halbrane, I should have had no right to insist on his proceeding to the island for the sole purpose of putting me ashore. But a supply of water was indispensable, and besides, it might be possible there to put the schooner in a condition to contend with the icebergs and gain the open sea, since open it was beyond the 82nd parallel; in fact, to attempt what Lieutenant Wilkes of the American Navy was then attempting. The navigators knew at this period that from the middle of November to the beginning of March was the limit during which some success might be looked for. The temperature is more bearable then, storms are less frequent, the icebergs break loose from the mass, the ice wall has holes in it, and perpetual day reigns in that distant region. Tristan d'Acunha lies to the south of the zone of the regular south-west winds. Its climate is mild and moist. The prevailing winds are west and north-west, and, during the winter (August and September), south. The island was inhabited from 1811 by American whale fishers. After them, English soldiers were installed there to watch the St. Helena seas, and these remained until after the death of Napoleon in 1821. Several years later, the group of islands populated by Americans and Dutchmen from the Cape acknowledged the suzerainty of Great Britain. But this was not so in 1839. My personal observation at that date convinced me that the possession of Tristan d'Acunha was not worth disputing. In the 16th century the islands were called the Land of Life. On the 5th of September, in the morning, the towering volcano of the chief island was signalled, a huge snow-covered mass, whose crater formed the basin of a small lake. Next day, on our approach, we could distinguish a vast, heaped-up lava field. At this distance, the surface of the water was striped with gigantic seaweeds, vegetable ropes, varying in length from 600 to 1,200 feet, and as thick as a wine barrel. Here I should mention that for 3 days subsequent to the finding of the fragment of ice, Captain Len Guy came on deck for strictly nautical purposes only, and I had no opportunity of seeing him except at meals, when he maintained silence, that not even James West could have enticed him to break. I made no attempt to do this, being convinced that the hour would come when Len Guy would again speak to me of his brother, and of the efforts which he intended to make to save him and his companions. Now I repeat, the season being considered, that hour had not come when the schooner cast anchor on the 6th of September at Ansiedling, in Falmouth Bay, precisely in the place indicated in Arthur Pym's narrative as the moorings of the Jane. At that period of the arrival of the Jane, an ex-corporal of the English artillery named Glass reigned over a little colony of 26 individuals, who traded with the Cape, and whose only vessel was a small schooner. At our arrival this Glass had more than 50 subjects, and was, as Arthur Pym remarked, quite independent of the British government. Relations with the ex-corporal were established on the arrival of the Halbrane, and he proved very friendly and obliging. West, to whom the captain left the business of refilling the water tanks and taking in supplies of fresh meat and vegetables, had every reason to be satisfied with Glass, who, no doubt, expected to be paid, and was paid, handsomely. The day after our arrival I met ex Corporal Glass, a vigorous, well preserved man, whose 60 years had not impaired his intelligent vivacity. Independently of his trade with the Cape and the Falklands, he did an important business in seal skins and the oil of marine animals, and his affairs were prosperous. As he appeared very willing to talk, I entered briskly into conversation with this self-appointed governor of a contented little colony, by asking him, "Do many ships put into Tristan d'Acunha?" "As many as we require," he replied, rubbing his hands together behind his back, according to his invariable custom. "In the fine season?" "Yes, in the fine season, if indeed we can be said to have any other in these latitudes." "I congratulate you, Mr. Glass, but it is to be regretted that Tristan d'Acunha has not a single port. If you possessed a landing stage, now—" "For what purpose, sir, when nature has provided us with such a bay as this, where there is shelter from gales, and it is easy to lie snug right up against the rocks? No, Tristan has no port, and Tristan can do without one." Why should I have contradicted this good man? He was proud of his island, just as the Prince of Monaco is justly proud of his tiny principality. I did not persist, and we talked of various things. He offered to arrange for me an excursion to the depth of the thick forests which clothed the volcano up to the middle of the central cove. I thanked him, but declined his offer, preferring to employ my leisure on land in some mineralogical studies. Besides, the Halbrane was to set sail so soon as she had taken in her provisions. "Your captain is in a remarkable hurry," said Governor Glass. "You think so?" "He is in such haste that his lieutenant does not even talk of buying skins or oil from me." "We require only fresh victuals and fresh water, Mr. Glass." "Very well," replied the Governor, who was rather annoyed. "What the Halbrane will not take, other vessels will." Then he resumed: "And where is your schooner bound for on leaving us?" "For the Falklands, no doubt, where she can be repaired." "You, sir, are only a passenger, I suppose?" "As you say, Mr. Glass, and I had even intended to remain at Tristan d'Acunha for some weeks, but I have had to relinquish that project." "I am sorry to hear it, sir. We would have been happy to offer you hospitality while awaiting the arrival of another ship." "Such hospitality would have been most valuable to me," I replied, "but unfortunately I cannot avail myself of it." In fact, I had finally resolved not to quit the schooner, but to embark for America from the Falkland Islands without much delay. I felt sure that Captain Len Guy would not refuse to take me to the islands. I informed Mr. Glass of my intention, and he remarked, still in a tone of annoyance, "As for your captain, I have not even seen the colour of his hair." "I don't think he has any intention of coming ashore." "Is he ill?" "Not to my knowledge, but it does not concern you, since he has sent his lieutenant to represent him." "Oh, he is a cheerful person. One may extract 2 words from him occasionally. Fortunately, it is easier to get coin out of his pocket than speech out of his lips." "That's the important thing, Mr. Glass." "You are right, sir. Mr. Joerling of Connecticut, I believe?" I assented. "So I know your name, while I have yet to learn that of the captain of the Halbrane." "His name is Guy, Len Guy." "An Englishman?" "Yes, an Englishman." "He might have taken the trouble to pay a visit to a countryman of his, Mr. Jeorling. But stay, I had some dealings formerly with a captain of that name." "Guy? Guy? William Guy?" I asked quickly. "Precisely, William Guy." "Who commanded the Jane?" "The Jane? Yes, the same man." "An English schooner which put in at Tristan d'Acunha 11 years ago?" "11 years, Mr. Jeorling. I had been settled in the island where Captain Jeffrey of the Berwick of London found me in the year 1824, for full 7 years. I perfectly recall this William Guy as if he were before me. He was a fine, open hearted fellow, and I sold him a cargo of sealskins. He had the air of a gentleman, rather proud, but good natured. And the Jane? I can see her now at her mooring in the same place as the Halbrane. She was a handsome vessel of 180 tons, very slender forwards. She belonged to the port of Liverpool. Yes, that is true. All that is true. And is this Jane still afloat, Mr. Jeorling? No, Mr. Glass. Was she lost? The fact is only too true, and the greater part of her crew with her. Will you tell me how this happened? Willingly. On leaving Tristan d'Acunha, the Jane headed for the bearings of the Aurora and other islands, which William Guy hoped to recognize from information. That came from me, interrupted the ex corporal. And those other islands, may I learn whether the Jane discovered them? No, nor the Auroras either, although William Guy remained several weeks in these waters, running from east to west, with a lookout always at the masthead. He must have lost his bearings, Mr. Jeorling, for if several whalers who were well deserving of credit are to be believed, these islands do exist, and it was even proposed to give them my name. That would have been but just, I replied politely. It will be very vexatious if they are not discovered some day, added the Governor, in a tone which indicated that he was not devoid of vanity. It was, then, I resumed, that Captain Guy resolved to carry out a project he had long cherished, and in which he was encouraged by a certain passenger who was on board the Jane. "Arthur Gordon Pym!" exclaimed Glass, "and his companion, one Dirk Peters. The two had been picked up at sea by the schooner." "You knew them, Mr. Glass?" I asked eagerly. "Knew them, Mr. Jeorling? I should think I did, indeed. That Arthur Pym was a strange person, always wanting to rush into adventures. A real rash American, quite capable of starting off to the moon. Has he gone there at last?" "No, not quite, Mr. Glass, but during her voyage the schooner, it seems, did clear the polar circle and pass the ice wall. She got further than any ship had ever done before." "What a wonderful feat!" "Yes. Unfortunately the Jane did not return. Arthur Pym and William Guy escaped the doom of the Jane and the most of her crew. They even got back to America. How, I do not know. Afterwards Arthur Pym died, but under what circumstances I am ignorant. As for the half breed, after having retired to Illinois, he went off one day without a word to any one, and no trace of him has been found." "And William Guy?" asked Mr. Glass. I related the finding of the body of Patterson, the mate of the Jane, and I added that everything led to the belief that the captain of the Jane and 5 of his companions were still living on an island in the austral regions, at less than 6° from the pole. "Ah, Mr. Jeorling," cried Glass, "if some day William Guy and his sailors might be saved! They seem to me to be such fine fellows." "This is what the Halbrane is certainly going to attempt, so soon as she is ready, for her captain, Len Guy, is William Guy's own brother." "Is it possible? Well, although I do not know Captain Len Guy, I venture to assert that the brothers do not resemble each other, at least in their behaviour. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 8. Bound for the Falklands. On the 8th of September, in the evening, I had taken leave of His Excellency the Governor General of the Archipelago of Tristan d'Acunha, for such is the official title bestowed upon himself by that excellent fellow, Glass, ex corporal of artillery in the British army. On the following day, before dawn, the Halbrane sailed. After we had rounded Herald Point, the few houses of Ansiedlung disappeared behind the extremity of Falmouth Bay. A fine breeze from the east carried us along gaily. During the morning we left behind us, in succession, Elephant Bay, Hardy Rock, West Point, Cotton Bay, and Daly's Promontory, but it took the entire day to lose sight of the volcano of Tristan d'Acunha, which is 8,000 feet high. Its snow-clad bulk was at last veiled by the shades of evening. During that week our voyage proceeded under the most favourable conditions. If these were maintained, the end of the month of September ought to bring us within sight of the first peaks of the Falkland group, and so, very sensibly, towards the south, the schooner having descended from the 38th parallel to the 55th degree of latitude. The most daring, or perhaps I ought to say, the most lucky of those discoverers who had preceded the Halbrane under the command of Captain Len Guy in the Arctic seas had not gone beyond Kemp the 66th parallel, Ballery the 67th, Biscoe the 68th, Bellinghausen and Morrell the 70th, Cook the 71st, Weddell the 74th, and it was beyond the 83rd, nearly 550 miles farther, that we must go to the succour of the survivors of the Jane. I confess that for a practical man of unimaginative temperament, I felt strangely excited. A nervous restlessness had taken possession of me. I was haunted by the figures of Arthur Pym and his companions, lost in Antarctic ice deserts. I began to feel a desire to take part in the proposed undertaking of Captain Len Guy. I thought about it incessantly. As a fact, there was nothing to recall me to America. It is true that whether I should get the consent of the commander of the Halbrane remained to be seen. But, after all, why should he refuse to keep me as a passenger? Would it not be a very human satisfaction to him to give me material proof that he was in the right, by taking me to the very scene of a catastrophe that I had regarded as fictitious, showing me the remains of the Jane at Tsalal, and landing me on that selfsame island which I had declared to be a myth? Nevertheless, I resolved to wait, before I came to any definite determination, until an opportunity of speaking to the captain should arise. After an interval of unfavourable weather, during which the Halbrane made but slow progress, on the 4th of October, in the morning, the aspect of the sky and the sea underwent a marked change. The wind became calm, the waves abated, and the next day the breeze veered to the north-west. This was very favourable to us, and in 10 days, with a continuance of such fortunate conditions, we might hope to reach the Falklands. It was on the 11th that the opportunity of an explanation with Captain Len Guy was presented to me, and by himself, for he came out of his cabin, advanced to the side of the ship where I was seated, and took his place at my side. Evidently he wished to talk to me, and of what, if not the subject which entirely absorbed him? He began saying: "I have not yet had the pleasure of a chat with you, Mr. Jeorling, since our departure from Tristan d'Acunha." "To my regret, captain," I replied, but with reserve, for I wanted him to make the running. "I beg you to excuse me," he resumed. "I have so many things to occupy me and make me anxious. A plan of campaign to organize, in which nothing must be unforeseen or unprovided for. I beg you not to be displeased with me." "I am not, I assure you." "That is all right, Mr. Jeorling, and now that I know you, that I am able to appreciate you, I congratulate myself upon having you for a passenger until our arrival at the Falklands." "I am very grateful, captain, for what you have done for me, and I feel encouraged to—" The moment seemed propitious to making my proposal, when Captain Len Guy interrupted me. "Well, Mr. Jeorling," he asked, "are you now convinced of the reality of the voyage of the Jane, or do you still regard Edgar Poe's book as a work of pure imagination?" "I do not so regard it, captain." "You no longer doubt that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters have really existed, or that my brother William Guy and 5 of his companions are living?" "I should be the most incredulous of men, captain, to doubt either fact, and my earnest desire is that the favour of Heaven may attend you and secure the safety of the shipwrecked mariners of the Jane." "I will do all in my power, Mr. Jeorling, and by the blessing of God I shall succeed." "I hope so, captain. Indeed, I am certain it will be so, and if you consent—" "Is it not the case that you talked of this matter with one Glass, an English ex corporal who sets up to be governor of Tristan d'Acunha?" inquired the captain, without allowing me to finish my sentence. "That is so," I replied, "and what I learned from Glass has contributed not a little to change my doubts into certainty." "Ah, he has satisfied you?" "Yes. He perfectly remembers to have seen the Jane 11 years ago, when she had put in at Tristan d'Acunha." "The Jane and my brother?" "He told me that he had personal dealings with Captain William Guy." "And he traded with the Jane?" "Yes, as he has just been trading with the Halbrane." "She was moored in this bay?" "In the same place as your schooner." "And Arthur Pym? Dirk Peters?" "He was with them frequently." "Did he ask what had become of them?" "Oh, yes, and I informed him of the death of Arthur Pym, whom he regarded as a foolhardy adventurer, capable of any daring folly." "Say a madman, and a dangerous madman, Mr. Jeorling." "Was it not he who led my unfortunate brother into that fatal enterprise?" "There is, indeed, reason to believe so from his narrative." "And never to forget it," added the captain in a tone of agitation. "This man Glass," I resumed, "also knew Patterson, the mate of the Jane." "He was a fine, brave, faithful fellow, Mr. Jeorling, and devoted, body and soul, to my brother." "As West is to you, captain." "Does Glass know where the shipwrecked men from the Jane are now?" "I told him, captain, and also all that you have resolved to do to save them." I did not think it proper to add that Glass had been much surprised at Captain Guy's abstaining from visiting him, as, in his absurd vanity, he held the commander of the Halbrane bound to do, nor that he did not consider the governor of Tristan d'Acunha bound to take the initiative. "I wish to ask you, Mr. Jeorling, whether you think everything in Arthur Pym's journal, which has been published by Edgar Poe, is exactly true?" "I think there is some need for doubt," I answered, "the singular character of the hero of those adventures being taken into consideration, at least concerning the phenomenon of the island of Tsalal, and we know that Arthur Pym was mistaken in asserting that Captain William Guy and several of his companions perished in the landslip of the hill at Klock Klock." "Ah, but he does not assert this, Mr. Jeorling. He says only that when he and Dirk Peters had reached the opening through which they could discern the surrounding country, the seat of the artificial earthquake was revealed to them. Now, as the whole face of the hill was rushing into the ravine, the fate of my brother and 29 of his men could not be doubtful to his mind. He was, most naturally, led to believe that Dirk Peters and himself were the only white men remaining alive on the island. He said nothing but this. nothing more. They were only suppositions. Very reasonable, are they not?" "I admit that fully, captain." "But now, thanks to Patterson's notebook, we are certain that my brother and 5 of his companions escaped from the landslip contrived by the natives." "That is quite clear, captain. But as to what became of the survivors of the Jane, whether they were taken by the natives of Tsalal and kept in captivity, or remained An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 9. Fitting out the Halbrane. On the 15th of October our schooner cast anchor at Port Egmont, on the north of West Falkland. The group is composed of 2 islands, one the above named, the other Soledad or East Falkland. Captain Len Guy gave 12 hours' leave to the whole crew. The next day the proceedings were to begin by a careful and minute inspection of the vessel's hull and keel, in view of the contemplated prolonged navigation of the Antarctic seas. That day Captain Len Guy went ashore to confer with the governor of the group on the subject of the immediate revictualling of the schooner. He did not intend to make expense a consideration, because the whole adventure might be wrecked by an unwise economy. Besides, I was ready to aid with my purse, as I told him, and I intended that we should be partners in the cost of this expedition. James West remained on board all day, according to his custom in the absence of the captain, and was engaged until evening in the inspection of the hold. I did not wish to go ashore until the next day. I should have ample time while we remained in port to explore Port Egmont and its surroundings, and to study the geology and mineralogy of the island. Hurliguerly regarded the opportunity as highly favourable for the renewal of talk with me, and availed himself of it accordingly. He accosted me as follows: "Accept my sincere compliments, Mr. Jeorling." "And wherefore, boatswain?" "On account of what I have just heard, that you are to come with us to the far end of the Antarctic seas." "Oh, not so far, I imagine, and if it is not a matter of going beyond the 84th parallel." "Who can tell?" replied the boatswain. "At all events, the Halbrane will make more degrees of latitude than any other ship before her." "We shall see." "And does that not alarm you, Mr. Jeorling?" "Not in the very least." "Nor us, rest assured. No, no. You see, Mr. Jeorling, our captain is a good one, although he is no talker. You only need to take him the right way. First he gives you the passage to Tristan d'Acunha that he refused you at first. Now he extends it to the Pole." "The Pole is not the question, boatswain." "Ah, it will be reached at last some day." "The thing has not yet been done, and besides I don't take much interest in the Pole, and have no ambition to conquer it. In any case, it is only to Tsalal Island." "Tsalal Island, of course. Nevertheless, you will acknowledge that our captain has been very accommodating to you, and and therefore I am much obliged to him, boatswain, and, I hasten to add, to you also, for since it is to your influence I owe my passage." Hurliguerly, a good fellow at bottom, as afterwards I learned, discerned a little touch of irony in my tone, but he did not appear to do so. He was resolved to persevere in his patronage of me, and indeed his conversation could not be otherwise than profitable to me, for he was thoroughly acquainted with the Falkland Islands. The result was that on the following day I went ashore adequately prepared to begin my perquisitions. At that period the Falklands were not utilized as they have been since. It was at a later date that Port Stanley, described by Elisée Reclus, the French geographer, as ideal, was discovered. Port Stanley is sheltered at every point of the compass, and could contain all the fleets of Great Britain. If I had been sailing for the last 2 months with bandaged eyes, and without knowing whither the Halbrane was bound, and had been asked, during the first few hours at our moorings, "Are you in the Falkland Islands or in Norway?" I should have puzzled how to answer the question, for here were coasts forming deep cracks, the steep hills with peaked sides, and the coast ledges faced with grey rock. Even the seaside climate, exempt from great extremes of cold and heat, is common to the two countries. Besides, the frequent rains of Scandinavia visit Magellan's region in like abundance. Both have dense fogs, and in spring and autumn, winds so fierce that the very vegetables in the fields are frequently rooted up. A few walks inland would, however, have sufficed to make me recognize that I was still separated by the equator from the waters of northern Europe. What had I found to observe in the neighbourhood of Port Egmont after my explorations of the first few days? Nothing but the signs of sickly vegetation, nowhere arborescent. Here and there a few shrubs grew, in place of the flourishing firs of the Norwegian mountains, and the surface of the spongy soil, which sinks and rises under the foot, is carpeted with mosses, fungi, and lichens. No, this was not the enticing country where the echoes of the sagas resound. This was not the poetic realm of Woden and the Valkyries. On the deep waters of the Falkland Strait, which separates the two principal isles, great masses of extraordinary aquatic vegetation floated, and the bays of the archipelago, where whales were already becoming scarce, were frequented by other marine mammals of enormous size. Seals 25 feet long by 20 in circumference, and great numbers of sea elephants, wolves, and lions of proportion no less gigantic. The uproar made by these animals, by the females and their young especially, surpasses description. One would think that herds of cattle were bellowing on the beach. Neither difficulty nor danger attends the capture, or at least the slaughter of the marine beasts. The sealers kill them with a blow of a club when they are lying in the sands on the strand. These are the special features that differentiate Scandinavia from the Falklands, not to speak of the infinite number of birds which rose on my approach: grebe, cormorants, black-headed swans, and above all, tribes of penguins, of which hundreds of thousands are massacred each year. One day, when the air was filled with a sound of braying sufficient to deafen one, I asked an old sailor belonging to Port Egmont, "Are there asses about here?" "Sir," he replied, "those are not asses that you hear, but penguins." The asses themselves, had any been there, would have been deceived by the braying of these stupid birds. I pursued my investigations some way to the west of the bay. West Falkland is more extensive than its neighbour La Soledad, and possesses another fort at the southern point of Byron's Sound, too far off for me to go there. I could not estimate the population of the archipelago even approximately. Probably it did not then exceed from 200 to 300 souls, mostly English, with some Indians, Portuguese, Spaniards, Gauche from the Argentine Pampas, and natives from Tierra del Fuego. On the other hand, the representatives of the ovine and bovine races were to be counted by tens of thousands. More than 500,000 sheep yield over $400,000 worth of wool yearly. There are also horned cattle bred on the islands. These seem to have increased in size, while the other quadrupeds, for instance, horses, pigs, and rabbits, have decreased. All these live in a wild state, and the only beast of prey is the dog fox, a species peculiar to the fauna of the Falklands. Not without reason has this island been called a cattle farm. What inexhaustible pastures, what an abundance of that savoury grass, the tussock, does nature lavish on animals there! Australia, though so rich in this respect, does not set a better spread table before her ovine and bovine pensioners. The Falklands ought to be resorted to for the revictualling of ships. The groups are of real importance to navigators making for the Strait of Magellan, as well as to those who come to fish in the vicinity of the polar regions. When the work on the hull was done, West occupied himself with the masts and the rigging, with the assistance of Martin Holt, our sailing master, who was very clever at this kind of industry. On the 21st of October, Captain Len Guy said to me, "You shall see, Mr. Jeorling, that nothing will be neglected to ensure the success of our enterprise. Everything that can be foreseen has been foreseen, and if the Halbrane is to perish in some catastrophe, it will be because it is not permitted to human beings to go against the designs of God. I have good hopes, captain, as I have already said. Your vessel and her crew are worthy of confidence. But supposing the expedition should be much prolonged, perhaps the supply of provisions? We shall carry sufficient for 2 years, and those shall be of good quality. Port Egmont has proved capable of supplying us with everything we require." "Another question, if you will allow me." "Put it, Mr. Jeorling, put it." "Shall you not need a more numerous crew for the Halbrane? Though you have men enough for the working of the ship, suppose you find you have to attack or defend in the Antarctic waters. Let us not forget that, according to Arthur Pym's narrative, there were thousands of natives on Tsalal Island, and if your brother, his companions, are prisoners." "I hope, Mr. Jeorling, our artillery will protect the Halbrane better than the Jane was protected by her guns. To tell the truth, the crew we have would not be sufficient for an expedition of this kind. I have been arranging for recruiting our forces." "Will it be difficult?" "Yes and no, for the Governor has promised to help me." "I surmise, captain, that recruits will have to be attracted by larger pay." "Double pay, Mr. Jeorling, and the whole crew must have the same." "You know, captain, I am disposed, and indeed desirous, to contribute to the expenses of the expedition. Will you kindly consider me as your partner?" "All that shall be arranged, Mr. Jeorling, and I am grateful to you. The main point is to complete our armament with the least possible delay. We must be ready to clear out in a week." The news that the schooner was bound for the Antarctic seas had produced some sensation in the Falklands, at Port Egmont, and in the ports of La Soledad. At that season a number of unoccupied sailors were there, awaiting the passage of the whaling ships to offer their services, for which they were very well paid in general. If it had been only for a fishing campaign on the borders of the polar circle, between the Sandwich Islands and New Georgia, Captain Len Guy would have merely had to make a selection. But the projected voyage was a very different thing, and only the old sailors of the Halbrane were entirely indifferent to the dangers of such an enterprise, and ready to follow their chief whithersoever it might please him to go. In reality it was necessary to treble the crew of the schooner. Counting the captain, the mate, the boatswain, the cook, and myself, we were 13 on board. Now, 32 or 34 men would not be too many for us, and it must be remembered that there were 38 on board the Jane. In this emergency the Governor exerted himself to the utmost, and thanks to the largely extra pay that was offered, Captain Len Guy procured his full tale of seamen. 9 recruits signed articles for the duration of the campaign, which could not be fixed beforehand, but was not to extend beyond Tsalal Island. The crew, counting every man on board except myself, numbered 31, and a 32nd for whom I bespeak special attention. On the eve of our departure, Captain Len Guy was accosted at the angle of the port by an individual whom he recognized as a sailor by his clothes, his walk, and his speech. This individual said in a rough and hardly intelligible voice, "Captain, I have a proposal to make to you." "What is it?" "Have you still a place?" "For a sailor?" "For a sailor." "Yes and no." "Is it yes?" "It is yes, if the man suits me." "Will you take me?" "You are a seaman?" "I have served the sea for 25 years." "Where?" "In the southern seas." "Far?" "Yes, far, far." "Your age?" "44 years." "And are you at Port Egmont?" "I shall have been there 3 years come Christmas." "Did you expect to get on a passing whale ship?" "No." "Then what are you doing here?" "Nothing. I did not think of going to sea again." "Then why do you seek a berth?" "Just an idea. The news of the expedition of your schooner is going on was spread. I desire, yes, I desire to take a part in it, with your leave, of course." "You are known at Port Egmont?" "Very well known, and I have incurred no reproach since I came here." "Very well," said the captain. "I will make an inquiry respecting you." "Inquire, captain, and if you say yes, my bag shall be on board this evening." "What is your name?" "Hunt." "And you are?" "An American." This Hunt was a man of short stature. His weather-beaten face was brick red, his skin was of a yellowish brown like an Indian's, his body clumsy, his head very large. His legs were bowed, his whole frame denoted exceptional strength, especially at the arms, which terminated in huge hands. His grizzled hair resembled a kind of fur. A particular, and anything but prepossessing character was imparted to the physiognomy of this individual by the extraordinary keenness of his small eyes, his almost lipless mouth, which stretched from ear to ear, and his long teeth, which were dazzlingly white, their enamel being intact, for he had never been attacked by scurvy, the common scourge of seamen in high latitudes. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 10. The Outset of the Enterprise. Here I was, then, launched into an adventure which seemed likely to surpass all my former experiences. Who would have believed such a thing of me? But I was under a spell which drew me towards the unknown, that unknown of the polar world whose secrets so many daring pioneers had in vain essayed to penetrate. And this time who could tell but that the Sphinx of the Antarctic regions would speak for the first time to human ears? The new crew had, firstly, to apply themselves to learning their several duties, and the old, all fine fellows, aided them in the task. Although Captain Len Guy had not much choice, he seemed to have been in luck. These sailors, of various nationalities, displayed zeal and good will. They were aware also that the mate was a man with whom it would not do to vex, for Hurliguerly had given them to understand that West would break any man's head who did not go straight. His chief allowed him full latitude in this respect. "A latitude," he added, "which is obtained by taking the altitude of the eye with a shut fist." I recognized my friend the boatswain in the manner of this warning to all whom it might concern. The new hands took the admonition seriously, and there was no occasion to punish any of them. As for Hunt, while he observed the docility of a true sailor in all his duties, he always kept himself apart, speaking to none, and even slept on the deck in a corner rather than occupy a bunk in the forecastle with the others. Captain Len Guy's intention was to take the Sandwich Isles for his point of departure towards the south, after having made acquaintance with New Georgia, distant 800 miles from the Falklands. Thus the schooner would be in longitude on the route of the Jane. On the 2nd of November this course brought us to the bearings which certain navigators have assigned to the Aurora Islands, 30 degrees 15 minutes of latitude, and 47 degrees 33 minutes of east longitude. Well, then, notwithstanding the affirmations, which I regarded with suspicion, of the captains of the Aurora in 1762, of the St. Miguel in 1769, of the Pearl in 1779, of the Princess and the Dolores in 1790, of the Atrevida in 1794, which gave the bearings of these three islands of the group, we did not perceive a single indication of land in the whole of the space traversed by us. It was the same with regard to the alleged islands of the conceited glass. Not a single little islet was to be seen in the position he had indicated, although the lookout was most carefully kept. It is to be feared that his Excellency the Governor of Tristan d'Acunha will never see his name figuring in geographical nomenclature. It was now the 6th of November. Our passage promised to be shorter than that of the Jane. We had no need to hurry, however. Our schooner would arrive before the gates of the iceberg wall would be open. For 3 days the weather caused the working of the ship to be unusually laborious, and the new crew behaved very well. Thereupon the boatswain congratulated them. Hurliguerly bore witness that Hunt, for all his awkward and clumsy build, was in himself worth 3 men. "A famous recruit," said he. "Yes, indeed," I replied, "and gained just at the last moment." "Very true, Mr. Jeorling, but what a face and head he has, that Hunt!" "I have often met Americans like him in the regions of the Far West," I answered, "and I should not be surprised if this man had Indian blood in his veins. Do you ever talk with Hunt?" "Very seldom, Mr. Jeorling. He keeps to himself, and away from everybody. And yet it is not for want of mouth. I never saw anything like his. And his hands! Have you seen his hands? Be on your guard, Mr. Jeorling, for if he ever wants to shake hands with you—" "Fortunately, boatswain, Hunt does not seem to be quarrelsome. He appears to be a quiet man who does not abuse his strength." "No, except when he is setting a halyard. Then I am always afraid the pulley will come down and the yard with it." Hunt certainly was a strange being, and I could not resist observing him with curiosity, especially as it struck me that he regarded me at times with a curious intentness. On the 10th of November, at about 2 in the afternoon, the look out shouted, "Land ahead! Starboard!" An observation had just given 57° 7' latitude and 41° 13' longitude. This land could only be the Isle de Saint Pierre. Its British names are South Georgia, New Georgia, and King George's Islands, and it belongs to the circumpolar regions. It was discovered by the Frenchman Barbe in 1675, before Cook, but although he came in second, the celebrated navigator gave it the series of names which it still bears. The schooner took the direction of this island, whose snow clad heights, formidable masses of ancient rock, rise to an immense altitude through the yellow fogs of the surrounding space. New Georgia, situated within 500 leagues of Magellan Straits, belongs to the administrative domains of the Falklands. The British administration is not represented there by any one. The island is not inhabited, although it is habitable, at least in the summer season. On the following day, while the men were gone in search of water, I walked about in the vicinity of the bay. The place was an utter desert, for the period at which sealing is pursued there had not arrived. New Georgia, being exposed to the direct action of the Antarctic polar current, is freely frequented by marine mammals. I saw several droves of these creatures on the rocks, the strand, and within the rock grottoes of the coast. Whole smalas of penguins, standing motionless in interminable rows, brayed their protest against the invasion of an intruder. I allude to myself. Innumerable larks flew over the surface of the waters and the sands. Their song awoke my memory of lands more favoured by nature. It is fortunate that these birds do not want branches to perch on, for there does not exist a tree in New Georgia. Here and there I found a few phanerogams, some pale coloured mosses, and especially tussock grass in such abundance that numerous herds of cattle might be fed upon the island. On the 12th November the Halbrane sailed once more, and having doubled Charlotte Point at the extremity of Royal Bay, she headed in the direction of the Sandwich Islands, 400 miles from thence. So far we had not encountered floating ice. The reason was that the summer sun had not detached any, either from the icebergs or the southern lands. Later on the current would draw them to the height of the 50th parallel, which in the southern hemisphere is that of Paris or Quebec. But we were much impeded by huge banks of fog, which frequently shut out the horizon. Nevertheless, as these waters presented no danger, and there was nothing to fear from ice packs or drifting icebergs, the Halbrane was able to pursue her route towards the Sandwich Islands comfortably enough. Great flocks of clangorous birds, breasting the wind, and hardly moving their wings, passed us in the midst of fogs. Petrels, divers, halcyons, and albatross bound landwards, as though to show us the way. Owing no doubt to these mists, we were unable to discern Traversey Island. Captain Len Guy, however, thought some vague streaks of intermittent light, which were perceived in the night between the 14th and the 15th, probably proceeded from a volcano which might be that of Traversey, as the crater frequently emits flames. On the 17th November the schooner reached the archipelago to which Cook gave the name of Southern Thule, in the first instance, as it was the most southern land that had been discovered at that period. He afterward baptized it Sandwich Isles. James West repaired to Thule in the large boat, in order to explore the approachable points, while Captain Len Guy and I descended on the Bristol strand. We found absolutely desolate country. The only inhabitants were melancholy birds of Antarctic species. Mosses and lichens cover the nakedness of an unproductive soil. Behind the beach a few firs rise to a considerable height on the bare hillsides, from whence great masses occasionally come crashing down with a thundering sound. Awful solitude reigns everywhere. There was nothing to attest the passage of any human being, or the presence of any shipwrecked persons on Bristol Island. West's explorations at Thule produced a precisely similar result. A few shots fired from our schooner had no effect but to drive away the crowd of petrels and divers, and to startle the rows of stupid penguins on the beach. While Captain Len Guy and I were walking, I said to him, "You know, of course, what Cook's opinion on the subject of the Sandwich group was when he discovered it. At first he believed he had set foot upon a continent. According to him, the mountains of ice carried out of the Antarctic Sea by the drift were detached from that continent. He recognized afterwards that the Sandwiches only formed an archipelago, but nevertheless his belief that a polar continent further south exists remained firm and unchanged." "I know that is so, Mr. Jeorling," replied the captain. "But if such a continent exists, we must conclude that there is a great gap in its coast, and that Weddell and my brother each got